Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into a Viking Longhouse on a winter night in Iceland, where firelight dances on carved wooden pillars and families gather close against the darkness that will last for months, sharing stories older than memory, while the wind howls outside and the fire crackles within. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We settle onto benches worn smooth by generations, feel the warmth of the central hearth, smell smoke and cooking stew and drying fish, hear the rhythm of the loom and the voice of the skald weaving words into magic. We imagine the children fighting sleep to hear one more tale, the women working by firelight, the men mending nets and sharpening tools, all of them living through the long dark together because survival meant community and winter meant closeness. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's not about memorizing kings or battles or the rise and fall of empires catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the stories told on winter nights, the hands that wove and carved and cooked, the voices that sang and argued and laughed, the human warmth that survived the coldest darkness. It's about the sacred space of home, the fire that never died, the bonds forged when the world outside became impossible and the world inside became everything. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. The Viking Age Longhouse stood as the centre of existence, not merely a building, but a world entire. Shelter and workshop, temple and courthouse, home and hall combined into one long structure that held everything necessary for survival in the north. From Iceland to Norway, from Greenland to Sweden, these buildings followed the same essential pattern: rectangular structures stretching 40 to 100 feet in length, built from whatever materials the land offered, timber in the forests, turf and stone where trees would not grow. The walls rose thick and strong, built to withstand winter storms that could last for days, winds that tore at anything not anchored deep. In Iceland, where trees were scarce, builders cut blocks of turf and stacked them like bricks, creating walls 3 feet thick or more, insulation against cold that could freeze a man solid if he ventured far from shelter. In Norway, where forests still covered the mountains, massive timber posts supported walls of split planks, chinked with moss and clay, roofed with wooden shingles or layers of birch bark covered in turf. Inside, the space was divided by function, but remained essentially open. One great room running the length of the building with smaller chambers at the ends or along the sides for storage, sleeping, animals in the worst weather. The central space held everything important: the hearth, the benches, the high seat where the head of household sat, the looms and work areas, the storage chests and hanging tools. This was where life happened, where the family and their dependents, sometimes 30 people or more, spent the months when going outside meant risking death. The hearth sat in the middle, a long fire pit running down the centre of the room, stone-lined to contain the flames, carefully tended day and night because letting the fire die meant starting over with flint and steel and tinder, a difficult task when everything was damp from breath and cooking and the wet clothes steaming dry. Smoke rose from the fire and escaped through vents in the roof, though much of it hung in the rafters, preserving the wooden structure, blackening the beams, giving the interior a permanent haze that smelled of wood smoke and cooking and human habitation. Benches lined both long walls, raised platforms where people sat during the day and slept at night, covered with furs and woven blankets, cushioned with stuffed leather or wool-filled sacks. These benches marked status and hierarchy. The family occupied the best positions near the high seat. Valued workers and free servants had their places. Thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage, slept nearest the doors where cold draughts entered, or in the storage rooms, or with the animals, their status reflected in their proximity to warmth and honour. Light came from the fire primarily, supplemented by oil lamps when resources allowed, small stone or ceramic bowls filled with seal oil or fish oil, with wicks of twisted moss or cloth, giving off a dim flickering glow and a smell that mixed with all the other smells of the longhouse. Windows were rare and small, mere openings that could be covered with oiled cloth or thin scraped hide to let in a little light while keeping out the cold. During winter, when daylight lasted only a few hours, the longhouse existed in perpetual dimness, the fire providing warmth and light and the focal point around which all activity revolved. The air inside was thick, heavy with moisture from breathing and cooking, with smoke from the fire, with the smell of unwashed bodies, drying fish, stored onions and grain, woolen clothes wet from snow, the manure from animals kept inside during the worst storms. Modern sensibilities would find it overwhelming, but for the Vikings it was the smell of home, of safety, of community gathered against the killing cold outside. The roof soared overhead, supported by massive posts carved with patterns, or left plain depending on the wealth and status of the household. Some posts bore images of gods, others geometric designs or scenes from stories, the carving done during long winter evenings, transforming structural necessity into art. The underside of the roof itself might be decorated in wealthy homes, painted or carved, though most remained plain smoke-blackened wood. This was the world of the Viking Longhouse, cramped by modern standards but spacious by medieval ones, dark and smoky and smelling of life in all its forms. It was not comfortable in any modern sense, yet it represented the highest achievement of Norse domestic architecture, a space designed through generations of trial and error to keep humans alive through months when the world outside became hostile to existence. In the 9th and 10th centuries, at the height of Viking expansion, thousands of these longhouses dotted Scandinavia and the North Atlantic settlements. Each one held a family, extended kin, workers, slaves, all the people bound together by blood or obligation or simple necessity. Each one followed the same pattern because the pattern worked, because survival in the north required specific adaptations, because the longhouse represented accumulated wisdom about how to endure. Winter was coming, it always came. The longhouse waited, ready to receive its people, to shelter them through the darkness, to keep the fire burning while the world outside froze. The benches waited for those who would sit and sleep and live and die within those walls. The hearth waited for the wood that would feed it through the long night. The stories waited to be told again, the same stories ancestors had told, the stories that made the darkness bearable and transformed survival into culture. The modern rediscovery of Viking domestic life began not with warriors or ships, but with farmers noticing odd mounds in their fields, slight rises in otherwise flat ground, lines of darker soil where ancient walls had collapsed and decayed into the earth. For centuries, people had ploughed over these remains without knowing what they represented, the longhouses so completely absorbed back into the landscape that they became invisible, just another irregularity in terrain full of irregularities. The first systematic excavations of Viking Age longhouses started in Iceland in the 1800s, when antiquarians began to wonder about the odd rectangular depressions visible in certain pastures. These scholars knew the Sagas, those medieval Icelandic texts describing the lives of their ancestors, and the Sagas mentioned farmsteads and halls, but connecting those literary descriptions to physical remains required imagination and careful digging. The Icelandic soil preserved what Norwegian earth often did not: the acidity of peat, the lack of trees to disturb the ground with roots, the relative stability of the landscape, all conspired to maintain the outline of structures that had stood 1,000 years before. When excavators carefully removed layers of accumulated soil and peat, they found post holes, the dark stains where wooden pillars had rotted away, marking the exact location of walls and roof supports. They found hearthstones still in place, blackened by fires that had burned out centuries ago. They found middens, trash heaps containing the debris of daily life, broken pottery and animal bones, worn-out tools and broken gaming pieces. At Stong in Iceland, volcanic ash from a medieval eruption had buried an entire farmstead in the year 1104, preserving it like Pompeii on a smaller scale. When archaeologists excavated this site in the 1930s, they found not just the outline of buildings but the actual floor layers, artifacts still sitting where they had been dropped when the inhabitants fled the approaching ash cloud. Here was a longhouse exactly as the sagas described, with central hearth and side benches, with a smaller room attached that had been a dairy, with storage buildings and a smithy nearby. The excavation revealed details that transformed scholarly understanding. The longhouse was smaller than literary description suggested, about 60 feet long, reminding researchers that sagas exaggerated for dramatic effect, that poetic truth differed from archaeological truth. But it was also more sophisticated than expected, with careful drainage channels dug beneath the floor to prevent moisture from rising through the packed earth, with stone paving at high traffic areas to prevent mud, with a clever smoke vent system in the roof. In Greenland, where Norse settlers had established farms during the medieval warm period, archaeologists found longhouses adapted to even harsher conditions. The walls here were massively thick, built of turf and stone, some over 6 feet deep, creating such effective insulation that the body heat of inhabitants and animals could keep the interior above freezing, even when temperatures outside dropped far below zero. These Greenland longhouses were smaller, conserving heat, but followed the same essential pattern, proof that Vikings carried their architectural tradition wherever they settled. At Borg in Norway, excavators uncovered an enormous longhouse, over 200 feet long, a chieftain's hall from the 8th or 9th century. This was the kind of structure mentioned in heroic poetry, where warriors feasted and lords held court, but archaeology showed it was also a working farm, with areas for textile production, food storage, animal sheltering. Even the mightiest halls were fundamentally farmsteads, combining prestige and practicality in equal measure. The Danish island of Bornholm yielded a different kind of discovery, an entire village of longhouses preserved beneath shifting sands. Here, archaeologists could see not just individual buildings, but how they related to each other, how communities were organised, how shared resources like wells and smithies served multiple households. The village pattern revealed social structures, showing that Viking society was more complex than the simple family units imagined by earlier scholars. Each excavation added pieces to the puzzle. Charcoal analysis showed what kinds of wood were burned, revealing trade patterns when expensive imported timber appeared in treeless Iceland. Soil chemistry indicated where animals had been kept, where food had been prepared, where people had slept. Microscopic examination of floor layers revealed seeds and pollen, showing what crops were grown, what weeds came up in the fields, what time of year the building was occupied. The most moving discoveries were the small personal items that spoke across centuries. A child's toy, a carved wooden horse small enough to fit in a pocket, a comb missing half its teeth, worn down by years of use, a spindle whorl decorated with a woman's name, the tool she used every day to spin wool into thread, a gaming piece, part of a set for playing Nefertafel, the Norse board game, suggesting long winter evenings of entertainment. These objects were not valuable in monetary terms, which is why they were left behind when households moved or abandoned their farms. But they were priceless to archaeologists because they represented real people, individuals who lived in these spaces, who worked and played and made the mundane choices that filled their days. Preservation varied wildly. In some locations only the darkest soil stains remained, requiring interpretation and imagination to reconstruct what had stood there. In others, like the Osberg ship burial in Norway, organic materials survived in waterlogged conditions, providing actual wood and textiles, giving texture and detail to what was usually a ghostly outline. Every site added information, building a composite picture of longhouse life drawn from hundreds of individual discoveries. Modern techniques added layers to what earlier excavators had found. Ground-penetrating radar allowed archaeologists to map buried structures without disturbing them. Chemical analysis of residues on pottery revealed what had been cooked in those vessels 1,000 years before. DNA analysis of bones from middens showed what animals had been raised and butchered. Isotope studies of human remains indicated diet, revealing differences between social classes, between coastal and inland populations, between different time periods. The discoveries continued. Each season brought new excavations, new insights, new questions. The longhouses emerged from the earth gradually, incrementally, their secrets revealed piece by piece through patient scholarly work. What began as antiquarian curiosity became rigorous science, transforming romantic notions about Viking life into concrete understanding about how people actually lived, what they ate and wore and built and believed, how they survived the darkness and cold, how they created culture and meaning in a world that modern people would find barely habitable. The hearth spoke most powerfully. Every longhouse had one, and every excavation found it, the stones still in place, the ash layers still visible, the centre around which everything else had been arranged. The fire was gone, cold for 1,000 years, but its location remained, marked in the earth, waiting to tell anyone who would listen about the warmth it had provided, the meals it had cooked, the light it had given, the stories it had illuminated on long winter nights when the world outside was dark and frozen, and the world inside was all that mattered. When the first longhouse excavations revealed their secrets, scholars were forced to confront a contradiction between the Vikings of popular imagination and the Vikings of archaeological reality. The 19th and early 20th centuries had constructed an image of Norsemen as warriors primarily, raiders and conquerors who burst from Scandinavia to terrorize medieval Europe, pagans who burned monasteries and fought with legendary ferocity. This image came from medieval chronicles written by their victims, from heroic sagas that emphasized battle and adventure, from a cultural fascination with the dramatic and violent. The longhouses told a different story. Here were the remains of farmers, not warriors. Textile production on an industrial scale, food storage for surviving harsh winters, animal husbandry, craft production, the everyday labour of survival in a difficult climate. The excavations revealed that for every Viking who went raiding, dozens stayed home tending fields and animals, weaving cloth and making tools, raising children and maintaining the complex social structures that made raids possible in the first place. This revelation challenged national myths that Scandinavian countries had built around their Viking past. Norway, Sweden and Denmark had embraced the warrior image, using it to construct narratives of national strength and maritime prowess. The longhouses suggested something more complex, a society where domestic labour was equally important to martial valour, where the skills of survival mattered as much as the skills of combat, where most people lived their entire lives without ever seeing a raid or a battle. The initial scholarly response was resistance. Surely these farmsteads were where warriors rested between campaigns. Surely the domestic evidence was secondary to the military culture documented in written sources. But as more longhouses were excavated, as the sheer volume of evidence for peaceful agricultural life accumulated, the old interpretations became impossible to maintain. The Vikings were farmers who sometimes raided, not raiders who occasionally farmed. The distinction mattered profoundly. Women's history scholars seized on the longhouse evidence with particular interest. The sagas mentioned powerful women, matriarchs who managed estates and influenced decisions, but these literary accounts could be dismissed as fiction or exaggeration. The archaeology proved otherwise. Textile production dominated longhouse activity, and textile production was women's work in Norse society. The looms, the spindles, the evidence of wool processing at every site all pointed to women as the primary economic producers in these communities. The status of women became a subject of intense debate. Some scholars argued that control over textile production gave Norse women unusual economic power, that their labour was too valuable for them to be marginalised the way women were in other medieval societies. Others countered that being essential to the economy did not necessarily translate to social or political power, that women could be simultaneously valued and subordinated. The longhouses provided evidence for both positions, showing women's work as central while also revealing spatial divisions that suggested gender segregation and hierarchy. The discovery of weaving tools in wealthy graves confirmed that textile production carried prestige. A woman buried with an elaborate set of weaving equipment was being honoured for her skill and status, her identity tied to her craft in the same way a warrior's identity was tied to his weapons. This challenged assumptions about what activities conferred status in Viking society, suggesting that productive labour was honoured alongside military prowess. Children appeared in the archaeological record through their toys and small tools, through burials that showed different treatment for the young, through evidence of learning and play. The longhouse was clearly a family space, designed for raising the next generation, for teaching skills through observation and practice, for integrating children into the work of survival from an early age. This emphasis on family contradicted the image of Vikings as restless adventurers always seeking new horizons, showing instead that most sought stability, continuity, the passing down of land and knowledge to descendants. The elderly presence in longhouses was evidenced by skeletal remains showing advanced age despite the harsh conditions, by the spatial organisation that gave honoured positions to those no longer capable of heavy labour, by grave goods that suggested respect for age and experience. Viking society, it turned out, valued its elders, kept them integrated into the household, sought their wisdom and stories, maintained them even when they could no longer contribute physical labour. Slaves complicated the picture considerably. Every longhouse of significant size showed evidence of a servile workforce, people who had no choice about their presence, who occupied the least desirable spaces, who were buried without the grave goods that marked free status. The Vikings practiced slavery extensively, capturing people in raids and using them for the hardest and most unpleasant labour. This reality sat uncomfortably alongside modern Scandinavian identity, forcing a reckoning with less admirable aspects of Norse culture. The religious dimension surprised many researchers. Longhouses were not just secular spaces but had sacred functions, serving as temples in communities too small to maintain separate religious buildings. Evidence of ritual activity appeared in foundation deposits, in carefully placed objects beneath post holes, in the orientation of buildings according to astronomical phenomena, in the decoration of high seat pillars with religious imagery. The home and the holy were not separated in Norse thinking. The longhouse was simultaneously profane and sacred, a place where gods were honoured and everyday life unfolded without distinction between the two. The sophistication of longhouse engineering challenged assumptions about Viking technical capability. These were not crude structures, but carefully designed buildings incorporating advanced understanding of materials, structural loads, insulation, drainage, and environmental adaptation. The builders possessed knowledge gained through generations of experimentation, refined through success and failure, passed down through demonstration and practice. They were engineers in every meaningful sense, solving complex problems with available resources. Public fascination followed scholarly revelations. Museum exhibits featuring reconstructed longhouses drew crowds eager to see how their ancestors actually lived. Experimental archaeology projects built working longhouses using authentic techniques, then lived in them to test the functionality of ancient designs. These experiments validated much of what excavation suggested, confirmed that the structures worked as intended, revealed details that dry archaeological reports missed, like how smoke actually moved through the interior, or how cold seeped through even thick walls. The initial response to longhouse discoveries was thus a mixture of surprise, resistance, and gradual acceptance that the Vikings were more complex than anyone had imagined, that domesticity and violence coexisted in their culture, that they were simultaneously farmers and raiders, craftspeople and warriors, deeply rooted in home and family while occasionally venturing far afield for wealth and glory. The longhouses revealed the foundation upon which the more dramatic aspects of Viking Age culture rested, showing that even the most adventurous raiders returned to hearth and family, that home was what they fought to maintain and what they dreamed of during long voyages across cold seas. The central paradox of Viking culture reveals itself in the stark contrast between the longhouse and the longship, between the peaceful agricultural life evidenced in domestic archaeology and the violent raiding culture documented in terrified Christian chronicles. How could the same people who wove wool with such skill and patience also burn monasteries? How could a society so centered on home and family also celebrate warriors who died far from both? The answer lies not in resolving the contradiction, but in understanding that it was not a contradiction to the Vikings themselves, that violence and domesticity were complementary aspects of a single coherent worldview. The longhouse itself embodied this duality. It was a place of women's work and children's laughter, yes, but also where weapons hung on the walls within easy reach, where warriors gathered to plan raids, where captured thralls worked alongside free family members, where the fruits of violence were integrated into peaceful domestic routine. The cloth woven on longhouse looms was traded for silver taken in raids. The food cooked on longhouse hearths was purchased with wealth extracted from monasteries and coastal towns. The domestic and the martial were not separate spheres, but intertwined aspects of the same economic and social system. The sagas romanticized this duality without acknowledging its contradictions. They told stories of farmers who put down their ploughs to take up swords when honour demanded, who fought with legendary skill despite spending most of their time in agricultural labour, who returned from battles to resume ordinary life without apparent difficulty. Modern readers find these transitions jarring, but the sagas present them as natural, as the expected rhythm of a man's life, war and peace alternating like seasons, neither diminishing the other. Archaeology shows that most longhouse occupants never participated in raids, that the agricultural work required to maintain a household left little time for adventuring, that the romantic saga image of the farmer warrior was exactly that, romantic and exceptional rather than typical. But it also shows that weapons were common, that men trained for violence even if they rarely practiced it, that the capacity for aggression was cultivated alongside the capacity for patient domestic labour. Women's role in this contradiction deserves particular attention. They maintained the home that made raiding possible, managing complex households through the months or years when men were absent. They processed the wealth that raids brought back, turning silver into trade goods, distributing plunder according to social rules, maintaining the economic structures that gave raiding its purpose. They told stories that celebrated violence, raised sons to value martial prowess, mourned men who died in battle while honouring their deaths. They were complicit in the violence even as they remained separate from its practice. The contradiction extended to religion. The gods honoured in longhouse rituals were simultaneously gods of domestic prosperity and martial glory. Odin demanded sacrifice and rewarded warriors who died in battle, but he was also invoked for wisdom and poetry, for the skills needed to survive winter and govern justly. Thor protected farms from giants and chaos, but he did so through violence, his hammer crushing enemies, his strength maintaining order through force. Freya governed love and fertility, but she was also a war goddess who claimed half the slain warriors. The divine realm mirrored the human, combining domesticity and violence without seeing them as incompatible. The legal system revealed similar duality. Icelandic law, preserved in medieval texts but reflecting Viking Age customs, provided elaborate mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully, through arbitration and compensation, through public assemblies and negotiated settlements. But it also recognized that some disputes could only be resolved through violence, that honor sometimes demanded blood, that a man who would not fight to defend his reputation was no man at all. The Longhouse was where this tension played out, where insults festered during long winters, where feuds were planned and alliances formed, where the social mechanisms of both peace and violence were maintained. Children grew up immersed in this contradiction, listening to stories that celebrated both peaceful virtues and martial glory, learning domestic skills while also learning to fight, understanding from earliest age that survival required both kinds of knowledge. Boys learned to farm and herd animals, to work wood and leather, to maintain buildings and equipment, but also to use weapons, to wrestle and compete, to defend themselves and their families. Girls learned domestic crafts, but also heard stories of shield maidens, knew that women sometimes fought, understood that their work maintaining the home was itself a kind of battle against starvation and cold. The thralls, those captured in violence and forced into domestic servitude, embodied the contradiction most acutely. They were the human evidence of raiding, living reminders that the peaceful longhouse was funded by distant violence, that their labour was not given but taken, that domestic comfort rested on foundations of conquest and cruelty. Their presence was so normalised that free household members seemed not to notice the contradiction, or perhaps simply accepted it as natural, the way victors in any era rationalised their treatment of the defeated. The seasonal rhythm reinforced the duality. Summer was raiding season, when seas were navigable, and warriors could leave their farms in the care of women, children and thralls, seeking wealth and glory abroad. Winter was domestic season, when everyone gathered in the longhouse, when violence was impractical and survival required cooperation, when even enemies might shelter together rather than freeze separately. The year alternated between outward aggression and inward consolidation, between seeking new wealth and preserving what had been gained. Trade complicated the picture further. Many Vikings were merchants rather than raiders, travelling the same routes but exchanging goods peacefully rather than taking them by force. Yet the line between trade and raid was porous. A merchant ship could become a raiding ship depending on opportunity. A trading mission could turn violent if resistance seemed weak. The Longhouse received both kinds of wealth without distinguishing their sources. Silver was silver whether acquired through commerce or conquest. The contradiction was not unique to Vikings, of course. All agricultural societies capable of organised violence face the same duality, the same need to balance productive domestic labour with the capacity for destructive martial action. But the Vikings seemed unusually comfortable with the combination, unusually willing to honour both aspects without feeling compelled to choose between them or explain away the tension. Perhaps the key to understanding lies in recognising that from the Viking perspective there was no contradiction. Violence and domesticity were both forms of survival, both necessary strategies in a harsh world where weakness meant extinction, where winter could kill as surely as sword, where maintaining your place required both the strength to defend what you had and the skill to create what you needed. The longhouse and the longship were complementary technologies, one for preserving life, the other for taking it, both essential to the culture that produced them. The modern discomfort with this duality reveals more about us than about the Vikings. We prefer our historical cultures to be either peaceful or violent, civilized or barbaric. We struggle with ambiguity and moral complexity. The Vikings were both, always both, finding no contradiction in being both, and the Longhouse stands as permanent testimony to that uncomfortable truth, a place where love and craft flourished alongside preparation for violence, where domestic skills and martial training were equally valued, where the contradiction was simply life as it was lived, requiring no explanation and offering no apology. The scholarly debate about longhouse social structures began almost immediately after the first systematic excavations and continues today, each generation of researchers bringing new methodologies and new questions to the evidence. The central dispute revolves around how to interpret physical remains, how to bridge the gap between what archaeology reveals and what written sources describe, how to understand a culture separated from us by 1,000 years and radically different assumptions about life, family and society. The earliest scholars, working in the late 1800s and early 1900s, approached longhouses through the lens of their own Victorian values and romantic nationalism. They saw the high seat as a throne, the household head as a king in miniature, the social hierarchy as natural and beneficial. They interpreted the spatial organisation of longhouses as reflecting an orderly patriarchal system where everyone knew their place and accepted it without question. This view emphasised stability, tradition, and masculine authority, projecting contemporary ideals backward onto Viking society. By the mid-20th century, new theoretical frameworks challenged these assumptions. Marxist-influenced scholars looked at longhouses through the lens of class struggle, seeing the spatial divisions as evidence of economic exploitation, the thralls as an oppressed class whose labour enriched free households, the social system as fundamentally unequal and maintained through violence and ideology. These researchers emphasise conflict rather than harmony, noting that the peaceful domestic scene implied by earlier scholars required the forced labour of enslaved people who had no choice about their participation. Feminist scholars brought gender analysis to longhouse studies, asking what the prominence of textile production revealed about women's status and power. Some argued that control over this essential economic activity gave Norse women unusual autonomy, that their labour was too valuable for them to be relegated to subordinate positions. They pointed to grave goods showing wealthy women buried with elaborate textile equipment, to saga accounts of powerful matriarchs managing estates, to evidence that women could own property and initiate divorce. The longhouse, from this perspective, was a space where women's work was central and honoured. Other feminist scholars disagreed, arguing that economic importance did not necessarily translate to social power, that women could be simultaneously essential and subordinated, valued for their labour while denied political authority. They noted that the high seat went to men, that legal systems gave husbands authority over wives, that inheritance generally favoured male heirs, that the sagas celebrated masculine virtues while treating women's contributions as background. The spatial organisation of longhouses, they argued, reflected and reinforced gender hierarchy, despite women's economic centrality. The question of household size generated its own debates. How many people actually lived in a longhouse? The buildings could theoretically accommodate 30 or 40 people, but did they? Some scholars argued for large extended households including multiple generations. Married children with their own families, dependent relatives, servants, and thralls all living under one roof. Others suggested that nuclear families predominated, that the large buildings reflected seasonal variation in population, that during winter isolation everyone crowded together, but in summer, many people slept in outbuildings or temporary shelters. Archaeological evidence supports both positions depending on which site you examine. Some longhouses show continuous occupation by large groups, with multiple hearths suggesting subdivided internal space, with enough sleeping area for dozens of people. Others seemed designed for smaller groups despite their size, with much of the interior dedicated to storage and work areas rather than living space. The truth likely varied by region, by wealth, by historical period, no single model fitting all situations. The status of thralls sparked particularly heated debate. Everyone agreed that slavery existed in Viking society. The evidence was overwhelming. But scholars disagreed about its extent, its brutality, and its social meaning. Some minimized slavery's importance, suggesting that most households had few, if any, thralls, that the system was relatively benign, that slaves were often well treated and could earn their freedom. Others argued that slavery was fundamental to the Viking economy, that large-scale agricultural production required servile labour, that the treatment of thralls was harsh, and their opportunities for manumission limited. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Thralls appear in the record primarily through what they lacked. They were buried without grave goods, or buried in marginal locations, or not buried at all. Their living spaces were the worst in the longhouse, near doors where cold entered, or in storage rooms or outside in separate buildings. But separating thrall remains from those of poor free people is difficult, poverty and slavery producing similar archaeological signatures. Written sources describe slavery extensively, but with an elite bias, viewing thralls through the eyes of owners rather than the enslaved. Ritual activity in longhouses generated theories about the relationship between domestic and sacred space. Some scholars argued that longhouses were fundamentally secular, that religious activity occurred in separate temple buildings, that the home and the holy were distinct spheres. Others pointed to evidence of household rituals, foundation deposits beneath posts, deliberate arrangement of buildings according to astronomical alignments, high seat pillars decorated with religious imagery, burials placed near or beneath longhouse floors. The longhouse, these scholars argued, was itself a sacred space, a temple of daily life where gods were honoured through ordinary actions. The debate touched on fundamental questions about Norse religion and its practice. If longhouses served religious functions, did that mean every household head was a priest? Did women perform different rituals than men? Were thralls excluded from religious participation or integrated into it? The evidence suggests complex answers, household religion coexisting with communal religious centres, individual devotion alongside public ceremony, sacred and profane so intermingled that separating them may impose a distinction the Vikings themselves did not make. Comparative anthropology offered another lens for interpretation. Scholars studying communal longhouses in other cultures, from Iroquois longhouses in North America to communal halls in Southeast Asia, brought insights about how large groups manage shared space, how social hierarchy manifests in spatial organization, how winter confinement affects social dynamics. These comparisons suggested that some features of Viking longhouse life were universal responses to communal living rather than culturally specific Norse traits. But other scholars warned against over-reliance on comparison, arguing that every culture is unique, that importing insights from other contexts risks misunderstanding the specific historical and environmental factors that shaped Viking society. The Norse were not Iroquois or Balinese, and assuming that similar buildings produce similar social dynamics could lead to error. The longhouse must be understood on its own terms, through its own context, however difficult that understanding might be to achieve. Economic interpretations focused on the longhouse as a productive unit. How much wealth could a household generate? What was the balance between subsistence production and surplus for trade? How did households acquire the silver found in hoards, the imported goods that appear in excavations? Some scholars saw longhouse economies as largely self-sufficient, with trade playing a minor role. Others emphasized connections to wider networks, arguing that even isolated farmsteads participated in long-distance exchange, that Viking economy was more interconnected and market-oriented than traditional views suggested. Climate change emerged as a factor in recent decades. The medieval warm period, when temperatures were higher than before or after, enabled Norse expansion into marginal lands like Greenland and Iceland. Longhouses in these regions represented adaptations to environments that would later become uninhabitable when climate cooled. This introduced temporal variation. The longhouse of 900 was not identical to the longhouse of 1200. Environmental pressures and opportunities shaped architectural choices and social organization, in ways earlier scholars had not considered. The most recent theories incorporate multiple perspectives, acknowledging that Longhouse society was complex, contradictory, and varied across time and space. Gender hierarchy coexisted with female economic power. Slavery was both fundamental and contested. Religious activity was both communal and domestic. Nuclear families lived alongside extended kin groups. The Longhouse was simultaneously secular and sacred, peaceful and violent, stable and changing. What emerges from these debates is recognition that we cannot fully understand Viking Longhouse life, that too much is lost, that the people who could answer our questions have been dead for a millennium. But we can approach understanding, can build increasingly sophisticated models, can acknowledge complexity and ambiguity, can resist simplification while seeking insight. The theories multiply because the evidence supports multiple interpretations, because the Vikings themselves were diverse, because there is no single truth about Longhouse life, but rather many truths depending on when and where and who you were in that world of smoke and firelight and shared winter darkness. Archaeological investigation of Viking longhouses requires reading a language written in soil and stone, in darkness and density, in the subtle variations of earth that mark where posts stood or fires burned or people walked 1,000 years ago. The process begins with survey, identifying potential sites through landscape analysis, looking for the telltale mounds or depressions that suggest buried structures, using place names and land ownership records and oral tradition to locate promising locations. Ground-penetrating radar changed the investigation profoundly when it became available in the late 20th century. Instead of random test trenches and hopeful guesswork, archaeologists could now map entire sites before digging, seeing ghostly outlines of walls and buildings through layers of soil, identifying the most promising areas for excavation, understanding the full extent of settlements that might include multiple longhouses and associated structures. The technology works by sending radar pulses into the ground and measuring how they reflect off different materials, stone and wood and disturbed earth, all producing distinctive signatures. When excavation begins, the process is painstaking and slow. Archaeologists remove soil in thin layers, documenting everything, photographing and drawing each stage before proceeding. They are not treasure hunting but reading context, understanding that the relationships between objects matter as much as the objects themselves. A piece of broken pottery means little by itself, but found in association with charcoal and burnt grain at a specific depth, it tells a story about cooking and fire and daily routine. The post holes reveal the structure's skeleton. Vikings built longhouses using massive upright posts to support the roof, digging holes 3 or 4 feet deep to anchor these posts firmly. When the posts eventually rotted or the building was abandoned, the holes filled with darker soil, creating stains visible to trained eyes during excavation. By mapping these post holes, archaeologists can reconstruct the exact dimensions and layout of buildings that left no other trace, can see where walls stood, where internal partitions divided space, where the roof load was concentrated. The hearth speaks volumes. Every longhouse had a central fire pit, and its location remains clear in the archaeological record, marked by stones reddened from heat, by layers of ash and charcoal, by soil chemically altered by repeated burning. Analysis of the charcoal reveals what wood was burned, whether local or imported, what season it was cut based on growth rings, how hot the fires burned. The ash layers themselves can be dated using radiocarbon techniques, providing absolute chronology for the building's occupation. Floor layers preserve remarkable detail. The packed earth that people walked on absorbed organic materials, food scraps and plant remains, tiny fragments of textiles and leather, even pollen that blew in through doors or clung to clothing. Microscopic analysis of these floors reveals what plants grew nearby, what crops were cultivated, what time of year the building was occupied. Chemical analysis detects phosphates that indicate where animals were kept, where food was prepared, where people slept, the concentrations varying across the floor in patterns that map functional zones. Middens, the trash heaps where Vikings threw broken tools and food waste, provide some of the richest data. Everything discarded ended up there, and in favourable conditions much of it survived. Animal bones reveal diet and husbandry practices, which species were raised, at what age they were slaughtered, which cuts of meat were preferred. Fish bones and shells show what was gathered from sea and shore. Broken pottery and worn-out tools demonstrate craft traditions and trade connections. Even insects that infested grain stores or lived in thatched roofs can be recovered and identified, adding detail to the reconstruction of daily life. Soil sampling became standard practice in modern excavations. Archaeologists collect samples systematically across the site, analysing them in laboratories for chemical signatures, for microscopic plant and animal remains, for parasite eggs that indicate sanitation conditions, for all the invisible traces that bulk excavation might miss. A single cubic centimetre of soil can contain thousands of pollen grains, each identifiable to species, together painting a picture of the local environment and human impact on it. Experimental archaeology tests interpretations against reality. Researchers have built working longhouses using authentic techniques, then lived in them to understand how they functioned. These experiments revealed that smoke accumulation was worse than expected, that drafts came from unexpected directions, that spatial arrangements affected social interaction in ways not obvious from plans on paper. Living in a reconstructed longhouse for even a few days changes your understanding of what the archaeological evidence represents, makes the past tangible in ways no amount of theoretical analysis can achieve. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, provides precise chronology when wooden remains survive. Each tree ring represents 1 year of growth, and the pattern of wide and narrow rings reflects climate variation, creating a signature that can be matched to master chronologies extending back thousands of years. A piece of timber from a longhouse can thus be dated to the exact year the tree was cut, and if the sapwood is present, to the season. This precision allows archaeologists to date construction phases, to understand how buildings were modified over time, to connect events at different sites through synchronized chronology. DNA analysis of human and animal remains opened new investigative avenues. Bones from middens reveal what breeds of sheep or cattle were raised, how they relate to modern breeds when domestic animals were introduced to new regions. Human DNA shows family relationships, allowing archaeologists to identify who was buried together, which individuals were related, how kinship structured household composition. Ancient DNA can even detect diseases, showing what infections plagued Viking populations, how parasites spread through communities, what genetic conditions were common. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth reveals individual life histories. Different isotopes of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium incorporate into bone as it grows, reflecting diet and drinking water chemistry. By analysing these isotopes, researchers can determine whether someone grew up locally or came from elsewhere, whether their diet was primarily terrestrial or marine, whether they had access to high-status foods. Teeth, which form in childhood and do not remodel, preserve isotopic signatures from early life, allowing comparison with bone formed later, showing migration patterns and changing diet across a lifespan. The investigative toolkit keeps expanding. Remote sensing technologies identify sites without excavation. Computer modelling reconstructs how buildings looked and functioned. 3D scanning preserves exact spatial relationships. Database systems integrate information from multiple excavations. Each new technique adds depth to understanding, transforms what can be learned from fragmentary remains, pushes back the boundaries of what seemed unknowable. Yet for all the sophisticated methods, the core of archaeological investigation remains simple observation and logical inference, looking carefully at what survives, asking what it meant to the people who made and used it, considering alternative explanations, building interpretations carefully, testing them against evidence, revising when new data demands it. The technology helps but cannot replace the fundamental human work of trying to understand other humans across the gulf of time. The remains speak if you learn their language. A stain in the soil says there was a post here. A scatter of charcoal says fire burned here. A cluster of loom weights says someone wove cloth here. A pattern of smaller artifacts says a child played here. Together, these quiet statements build into paragraphs and pages, into a narrative of longhouse life recovered from earth and silence, a story the Vikings never intended to tell, but one that their discarded and forgotten materials tell anyway to anyone patient enough to read it. The objects recovered from longhouse excavations transform abstract architectural plans into intimate human spaces, each artifact a tangible connection to someone who lived and worked and died 1,000 years ago. These are not the treasures that end up in museum displays, not the elaborate jewellery or decorated weapons that speak of wealth and status. These are the everyday things, the broken and discarded tools of ordinary life, the objects too common and too worthless to preserve intentionally but too revealing to ignore. Cooking pots appear in every excavation, fragments of ceramic vessels shaped by hand or wheel, blackened by fire, sometimes still containing carbonized food residue. Analysis of these residues reveals what Vikings cooked: stews heavy with meat and barley, fish soup, porridges of various grains. The pots themselves show craft traditions. Local clay worked according to techniques passed down through generations, forms that balance functionality with available materials. Some pots were crude and utilitarian, others showed surprising artistry. Decorated with patterns or carefully finished surfaces, evidence that even mundane objects could be made beautiful. Loom weights numbered in the dozens or even hundreds at some sites, clay or stone objects pierced with holes, used to tension the vertical threads on warp-weighted looms. Their presence in such quantities speaks to the scale of textile production, to days and weeks and months of weaving, to the economic importance of cloth in Viking society. The weights came in different sizes for different thread weights, showing that weavers produced various grades of fabric from coarse wool for everyday wear to fine cloth for trade or special occasions. Spindle whorls, the small weights that made hand spinning possible, appear everywhere. These were personal tools, each spinner having favourites worn smooth by use, sometimes decorated with names or patterns, sometimes plain functional stone or ceramic. The distribution of spindle whorls across longhouse floors maps where women sat and worked, usually near windows for light or by the fire for warmth, their fingers constantly busy turning wool into thread during every idle moment. Gaming pieces suggest leisure and entertainment, small carved objects for playing Nefertafall or other board games mentioned in Sagas. These were not children's toys, but adult recreation, games of strategy played during long winter evenings, gambling stakes riding on the outcome. The pieces were often beautifully made, carved from bone or walrus ivory or wood, showing that Vikings invested craft skill in their entertainments, that play was valued enough to merit artistic effort. Combs appear frequently, elaborate objects carved from bone or antler, often decorated with geometric patterns or animal motifs. Hair care was clearly important, both for hygiene and appearance, the combs showing wear patterns indicating regular use. Broken combs were sometimes repaired rather than discarded. Holes drilled to allow riveting of pieces back together, evidence that these objects were valued despite being relatively simple to make. Whetstones for sharpening tools and weapons show up in context suggesting they were in constant use. Iron tools dulled quickly, required regular maintenance, the whetstone an essential item for any household. Some whetstones were portable, small enough to carry, suggesting that people took them to work sites or on journeys. Others were large stationary stones set up near the hearth, where the light was good for detailed sharpening work. Needles and pins, tiny metal objects easy to lose, nonetheless survived in numbers sufficient to show their importance. Sewing and textile repair were constant tasks, clothes wore out and needed mending, furs needed stitching together, leather needed working. The needles range from coarse for heavy fabrics to fine for delicate work, a gradation showing skilled craftwork and specialized tools. Keys appeared in women's graves, marking them as household managers, the one who controlled access to storage chests and locked rooms. These were not simple keys but elaborate status symbols, worn on chains or brooches, visible markers of authority and responsibility. The locks they opened were complex mechanisms. The chests they secured contained the household's most valuable possessions, cloth and silver, imported goods and family heirlooms. Fishing weights and hooks, net sinkers and line weights appear at coastal sites and near rivers, evidence of the subsistence strategies that supplemented farming. Fish were essential protein, dried and stored for winter consumption, the equipment for catching them carefully maintained and passed down through generations. The variety of sizes and types shows sophisticated knowledge of different fishing techniques for different species and conditions. Agricultural tools survive poorly because most were wood and iron, materials that corrode or decay. But occasionally waterlogged conditions preserve wooden handles, iron blades, fragments of ploughs and rakes and scythes. These tools show the physical labour of farming, the daily work of breaking soil and harvesting grain, the heavy toil that occupied most people most of the time. The wear patterns on blades reveal how they were used. The repairs show they were kept in service as long as possible. Leather working tools, awls and cutting blades bone needles for heavy stitching, appear in contexts suggesting that shoes and clothing were made and repaired at home rather than purchased. Self-sufficiency was essential in isolated communities, every household needing the skills to maintain their material culture to make what could not be obtained through trade. Woodworking tools were fundamental to longhouse maintenance, buildings constantly requiring repair, furniture needing construction, everyday objects requiring making and remaking. Axes for shaping timbers, knives for detail work, drills for making holes, scrapers for smoothing surfaces. The carpenter's toolkit appeared in various forms depending on wealth and specialization, but was present in some form at every site. Children's toys occasionally survived, small carved animals, spinning tops, miniature tools that served as teaching aids. These artifacts remind us that longhouses were spaces of learning and play, that childhood existed even in harsh conditions, that adults took time to make objects purely for children's entertainment and education. Textiles rarely survived except as tiny fragments or as impressions in corroded metal, but these scraps revealed remarkable information. Analysis showed various weaving techniques, different thread counts and patterns, evidence of dyeing using local plants or imported materials. The quality ranged from coarse utilitarian cloth to fine fabric suitable for elite consumption, showing that even this perishable product came in grades reflecting skill and intended use. Containers of various materials, wood and ceramic and leather, held the necessities of daily life. Butter and cheese in sealed vessels, grain in large pots or chests, dried fish hanging from rafters, salt in precious small amounts, all the stored food that meant survival through winter when nothing grew and hunting was difficult. The containers themselves were crafted with care, made to last, repaired when damaged, essential infrastructure for the household economy. The cumulative weight of these objects, these thousands of fragments of the ordinary, transforms our understanding more than any treasure hoard. They show patient skilled labour, show complex supply chains and craft specializations, show aesthetic sensibilities applied to everyday objects, show pride in workmanship even for things no one but the family would see. They make the longhouse real, fill it with the texture of lived experience, populate it with people whose hands made and used these things, people whose fingerprints occasionally survived in clay, people who were gone but whose objects remained to testify that they were here, they worked, they lived, they mattered. The relationship between Viking Age reality and the sagas that claim to describe it is one of the most fascinating and frustrating problems in medieval studies. The Icelandic sagas were written 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe. Composed in a Christian society looking back at pagan ancestors, shaped by literary conventions and political agendas and the simple fallibility of memory transmitted across generations. Yet they contain details about longhouse life so specific and so consistent with archaeology that they cannot be dismissed as pure fiction. The truth lies somewhere between history and story, and untangling the two requires careful attention to both textual and material evidence. The sagas describe longhouse layout with remarkable precision. They mention the high seat where the household head sat, the benches along both walls, the central hearth, the doors at either end. Archaeology confirms all of this, the physical remains matching literary descriptions in ways that validate the sagas as sources of information. But the sagas also exaggerate sizes, describe impossibly large halls, claim buildings held hundreds of people when archaeology shows they could barely hold dozens. The detail is accurate, but the scale is inflated, poetic truth rather than literal measurement. Eagle's saga describes a scene of winter hospitality, where travellers arrive at a longhouse and are given places according to their status, the worthy near the fire, the lesser near the doors where cold enters. This social mapping of space appears in excavations, the best sleeping platforms closest to the hearth, the worst positions at the periphery. The saga captures a social reality that archaeology can only infer, showing how spatial arrangements translated into hierarchy, how everyone in the longhouse understood their place through where they were allowed to sit and sleep. The Laxdæla saga describes women's work in detail, the management of dairies, the production of cloth, the preparation and preservation of food. These descriptions match archaeological evidence for women's labour, validate the interpretation that textile production dominated longhouse economy, show that saga authors remembered real domestic arrangements, even when they fictionalized the dramatic events that gave their stories narrative drive. The background details, the ordinary life that characters move through, retained authenticity even when the plot became legendary. But the sagas also present problems. They describe pagan religious practices from a Christian perspective, filtered through centuries of conversion and cultural change. When they mention household gods and religious rituals, are they recording genuine pre-Christian practice, or imagining what paganism might have looked like? Archaeology provides some answers. Household shrines and ritual deposits confirm that longhouses had religious functions, but the specific ceremonies and beliefs remain uncertain. The sagas are only source, but not necessarily a reliable one. The Njal saga describes blood feuds played out across generations, showing how longhouses became sites of violence when disputes escalated beyond peaceful resolution. Men killed enemies in their homes, burned entire households to death, attacked at night when families slept. These violent episodes might seem like saga invention, except that archaeology sometimes confirms them. Burnt longhouses with bodies still inside, weapons marks on bones. Evidence that literary violence reflected historical reality, however much it might have been dramatized. The treatment of women in sagas is particularly complex. Some sagas feature powerful women who manage estates, influence political decisions, even incite men to violence when honor demands it. Others relegate women to background roles, barely mentioning their existence. Which version reflects reality? Archaeology shows women's work was economically central, but archaeology cannot reveal whether this translated to political power. The sagas suggest it sometimes did, that individual women could wield authority, but whether this was common or exceptional remains uncertain. Slavery appears in sagas as background detail, thralls mentioned casually, their labour assumed, their status unquestioned. The sagas were written for elite audiences who saw nothing wrong with slavery, who took it for granted as part of social order. This casual acceptance makes the descriptions more rather than less reliable. The saga authors were not justifying slavery but simply including it as ordinary fact of life. When archaeology finds evidence of servile populations in longhouses, it confirms what the sagas suggested, that slavery was fundamental to household economy and social structure. Food and drink described in sagas matches what archaeology reveals about diet. The emphasis on meat and dairy, on ale and mead, on preserved fish and dried grain, all appears in analysis of food remains and cooking residues. But the quantities mentioned seem exaggerated. Sagas describe feasts lasting days with impossible amounts of consumption. Literary excess rather than practical reality. The types of food are accurate, the scale is legendary. Saga writers knew what people ate but inflated it for dramatic effect. The seasonal rhythm of longhouse life appears clearly in sagas. The long dark winter when everyone stayed inside telling stories and working on crafts. The summer when men left for raiding or trading, leaving women to manage farms. The brief harvest season when everyone worked frantically to gather what would sustain them through the next winter. This rhythm was fundamental to Viking life, and the sagas capture it accurately. Their plots often structured around seasonal transitions, conflicts that arose during winter confinement, journeys that began in spring and ended in autumn. Legal disputes described in sagas show elaborate mechanisms for conflict resolution. Assemblies where grievances were aired, compensation negotiated, decisions enforced through community pressure. These descriptions align with what we know of Viking Age lore from other sources, suggest that longhouses were not isolated units, but nodes in networks of legal and social obligation. The household existed within larger structures of governance, however decentralized and informal those structures might have been. The sagas describe material culture with accuracy that archaeology validates. The clothing, the weapons, the ships, the buildings all appear in both literary and material records with consistency that suggests saga authors were drawing on genuine cultural memory. They knew what things looked like, how they were made and used, the details of material life that formed the backdrop for their stories. This accuracy in describing objects lends credibility to their descriptions of social relationships and cultural practices that leave no archaeological trace. But we must always remember that sagas are literature, not documentary records. They were composed for entertainment, for moral instruction, for preserving family honor, for political purposes lost to us now. They shaped their material according to narrative needs, compressed time, conflated events, invented speeches, created coherent plots from messy reality. They are invaluable sources, but problematic ones, most useful when archaeology can confirm or challenge their claims, most dangerous when taken literally without critical analysis. The deeper mystery is not whether sagas tell truth or fiction, binary categories they refuse to fit, but how to use them alongside archaeology to build nuanced understanding of longhouse life. The sagas capture aspects of experience that material remains cannot: the emotional texture of winter confinement, the way disputes festered in close quarters, the importance of reputation and honour, the sound of poetry and the taste of ale, the human dimension that archaeology can only infer. Combined with physical evidence, they create fuller picture than either source alone could provide. The reality of Viking Longhouse life lies in the space between saga and archaeology, between literary imagination and material constraint, between what writers remembered or invented centuries later and what excavation reveals today. Both sources are partial, both contain truth mixed with error, both require careful interpretation, but together, approached critically and combined thoughtfully, they let us glimpse a world that disappeared a millennium ago but left traces sufficient to reconstruct not completely, but adequately, not with certainty but with reasonable confidence, not perfectly but well enough to understand how people lived and what mattered to them during those long winter nights by the fire. The arrival of winter transformed everything about Viking life, a seasonal shift so profound that it functioned as a turning point in every year's narrative, the moment when the world outside became hostile and the world inside the longhouse became total. In the far north, in Iceland and northern Norway, in Greenland and the Shetlands, winter meant darkness lasting months, the sun barely rising above the horizon, or not rising at all, a polar night that challenged human endurance and required social and psychological adaptations as important as the physical shelters that kept bodies alive. The transformation began gradually. In late autumn, as days shortened and temperatures dropped, households shifted into preparation mode. The final harvest had to be gathered, every grain of barley and oat, every root vegetable that could be stored. Animals were assessed, the weakest slaughtered because feeding them through winter was wasteful, the meat preserved through smoking or salting or freezing in the increasingly cold air. The strongest animals were kept alive, breeding stock for next year, their survival through winter, a gamble that sometimes failed when fodder ran out or disease struck the confined herds. Wood became precious beyond measure. Cutting and stacking firewood occupied every able person through the autumn months, building reserves sufficient to keep the central hearth burning continuously for half the year or more. In treeless Iceland, this meant burning dried peat or driftwood hoarded through summer, burning dried seaweed or even whale bones when other fuel ran out. The calculation was desperate and exact. Too little wood meant freezing, but gathering too much meant neglecting other essential preparations, the balance between competing necessities, determining who survived and who did not. Food storage required careful planning and considerable labour. Grain had to be dried thoroughly to prevent rot, then stored in chests or clay vessels sealed against moisture and vermin. Fish were gutted and hung to dry in the cold air, or packed in salt if salt could be obtained through trade. Meat was smoked over the hearth, or packed in barrels with preservatives. Butter and cheese were made from the autumn surplus of milk, sealed in containers, buried in peat to keep cool. Every household became a warehouse of preserved calories, their stores representing the margin between survival and starvation. The social composition of the longhouse shifted as winter approached. Workers who had laboured through summer on outlying farms or seasonal camps returned to the main hall. Travellers hurried to reach their destinations before snow made movement impossible. Extended family members who had been dispersed through the warmer months gathered together, safety and survival requiring consolidation of resources and labour. The household swelled to its maximum population just as the space available for ranging contracted to its minimum. When true winter arrived, when snow piled deep and winds howled and temperatures plunged, the longhouse door closed and did not open except for the briefest necessary excursions. Stepping outside meant bundling in every layer of wool and fur available, meant moving quickly to accomplish essential tasks, feeding animals or gathering snow to melt for water, then retreating back to the smoky warmth inside. The exterior world became alien and dangerous, a frozen wasteland where exposure meant death in minutes or hours depending on conditions. Inside, the rhythms of life slowed and concentrated. There was no fieldwork, no travel, no raiding, no trading. The frenetic activity of summer gave way to the patient endurance of winter. People rose late because darkness made dawn meaningless. They worked by firelight on tasks that could be done indoors, women spinning and weaving constantly, men carving and crafting, repairing tools and making new ones, everyone contributing to the household economy through craft production that would be used or traded when summer returned. The fire became the absolute centre of existence, the source of warmth and light, the means of cooking, the focus of all activity. Keeping it burning was a responsibility shared by everyone, children learning to tend flames, to add wood at the right intervals, to bank the fire at night so it would smoulder through until morning. Letting the fire die was catastrophe. Restarting it consumed precious resources and time, so someone was always watching, always maintaining the flames that stood between life and death. Darkness dominated in ways difficult for modern people to comprehend. The fire provided light but barely, illuminating a small circle while shadows filled the rest of the longhouse. Oil lamps helped but burned expensive fuel, were used sparingly, lit only for tasks requiring good visibility. Most of winter life occurred in dimness or darkness, people navigating by memory and touch, working by feel, their eyes adjusting to perpetual gloom, their sense of the space around them developing beyond visual reliance. The psychological impact of winter confinement was profound. 30 or 40 people living in close quarters for months, seeing the same faces every day, hearing the same voices, navigating the same social dynamics without escape or privacy. Tensions that could be diffused in summer through physical separation festered in winter proximity. Disputes had to be resolved, or at least managed because avoiding someone was impossible. The social skills required for winter survival were as important as the material preparations. The ability to maintain harmony in crowded conditions could determine whether a household thrived or tore itself apart. Stories became essential, not entertainment, but survival strategy. The long dark hours had to be filled with something or madness threatened. Skalds recited poems memorized through years of training, sagas that took hours to tell, complex narratives that transported listeners away from the cramped smoky present into heroic pasts or mythological realms. Children learned these stories by hearing them repeatedly, absorbing cultural knowledge and values through oral tradition, becoming the next generation of tale-tellers who would preserve this immaterial heritage. Craftwork occupied hands while stories occupied minds. Women wove at their looms, the rhythmic clacking a constant soundtrack to winter life, producing the cloth that was currency and necessity, trade good and clothing, the visible product of countless hours of patient labour. Men carved bone and antler, made tools and toys, worked leather and wood, their hands busy with detailed work that required concentration but allowed minds to wander or listen to stories being told. Games provided another outlet. Nafata-full boards coming out for matches that could last hours, dice games, betting games, any activity that added variety to the sameness of days. Gambling helped pass time but also caused disputes, fortunes in valuable objects changing hands, honour at stake in games, the intensity of play reflecting the pressure of confinement and the need for any distraction from monotony. Religious observance took on heightened importance during winter. Sacrifices were made to gods who controlled weather and survival, asking for their protection through the dark months, promising offerings if the household survived until spring. Household shrines received attention, small rituals performed, prayers offered, the sacred and mundane intertwining, because survival itself required supernatural aid in a world where nature seemed bent on human extinction. The turning point was not a single moment but a season-long transformation, the household closing in on itself, becoming a complete world. Self-sufficient and self-contained, the people within it dependent on each other absolutely. What they had prepared determined what they ate. Who they were stuck with determined their social reality. How well they managed fire and fuel and food determined whether they saw another summer. Winter was the test, the crucible, the long dark challenge that separated successful cultures from extinct ones, and the Vikings passed it year after year through combinations of material preparation, social cooperation, and cultural practices that made endurance possible. When spring finally arrived, when days began lengthening and snow began melting, and the door could open without inviting death, the relief was overwhelming. People emerged from the longhouse blinking in sudden brightness, weak from months of limited movement and poor diet, but alive, survivors of another winter, ready to resume the cycle of planting and growing and preparing for the next inevitable season of darkness and cold and confinement within the walls that had become the entire world. The months of winter confinement forced into existence social structures and mechanisms that would never have developed without that crucible of close quarters and shared survival. When 30 people lived in one room for half the year, when escape was impossible and privacy non-existent, human relationships evolved patterns of behaviour that managed the inherent tensions while maintaining the cooperation essential to collective survival. These patterns, forged in firelight and tested through countless dark months, became fundamental to Norse culture and spread wherever Vikings settled. The household hierarchy crystallised during winter in ways that summer's dispersed activities obscured. The head of household, usually a man but sometimes a widow, or powerful matriarch, sat in the high seat, a position of honour but also responsibility. This person made final decisions about resource allocation, about discipline, about responses to disputes, bearing the weight of leadership when mistakes could mean starvation or social collapse. The sagas emphasize the honour of the high seat, but the archaeological evidence suggests the burden, the constant management required to keep a crowded household functioning through months of stress. Women's authority operated differently, but no less powerfully. The mistress of the household controlled the keys to storage, decided when preserved food could be opened, managed the distribution of resources, supervised the textile production that occupied most women through the winter. Her domain was the domestic economy, and in winter that economy was everything, her decisions about food and fuel directly impacting survival. The gender hierarchy was real, but so was women's power within their sphere, a complex balance that winter made visible and essential. Children experienced winter confinement as education. They watched adults work and learned by imitation, girls mastering spinning and weaving and food preparation, boys learning to carve and craft and maintain tools. But they also learned social skills, how to behave in close quarters, how to read moods and avoid confrontations, how to be useful without being intrusive. The Longhouse was a school where lessons were not formal but constant, where culture transmitted through observation and participation rather than instruction. Thralls faced winter with particular hardship. They received less food, worse sleeping positions, harder work. Winter did not exempt them from their lower status, often intensified it. Their presence as property rather than people made more explicit when everyone was compressed into one space. Yet paradoxically, winter also created intimacy that summer avoided, thralls and free people living in such proximity that certain human recognitions became unavoidable. Shared songs and stories, shared work and warmth, created bonds that slavery's legal categories could not entirely erase, though those bonds rarely translated into freedom or better treatment. Conflict resolution became essential skill during winter. Disputes that could be ignored or postponed in summer demanded immediate attention in winter, because festering resentment poisoned the entire household. Norse culture developed elaborate mechanisms for managing honour and insult, for arbitrating disagreements, for determining compensation that satisfied aggrieved parties without requiring violence that would split the household. These mechanisms appear in saga accounts and in law codes, formalized versions of processes developed through practical necessity in confined winter spaces. The role of elders gained importance during dark months. Old people who could no longer do heavy labour still contributed essential knowledge, remembering past winters and how they were survived, knowing weather signs and food preservation techniques, serving as living libraries of accumulated wisdom. They also served as storytellers and historians, maintaining cultural continuity by reciting genealogies and sagas, teaching younger generations the narratives that defined Norse identity. Winter gave elders renewed purpose, their memories and stories valuable in ways that summer's physical labour economy did not always recognise. Marriage alliances were often negotiated during winter gatherings. Families stuck together in longhouses discussed potential unions between their children, arrangements that would strengthen bonds between households, create networks of mutual obligation, tie communities together through kinship. These negotiations could take months. involved elaborate considerations of property and status, required careful management of honour and expectation. Winter's forced proximity allowed families to assess each other's character and resources to judge whether an alliance would benefit both parties. Religious practice intensified during winter darkness. Midwinter celebrations marked the longest night, honouring gods who controlled the return of light, making sacrifices to ensure the sun would come back, that spring would follow winter as it always had but never felt certain. These communal rituals brought households together, reminded people they were part of larger social units, connected them to divine powers that transcended human weakness. The religious calendar structured time during months when natural markers were absent, when one dark day blended into another until ritual provided the only differentiation. Skills were shared during winter in ways that summer's busy work did not allow. Master craftspeople taught their trades, passing on knowledge that could not be written, but had to be demonstrated, learned, through watching and practicing under supervision. Young people tried their hands at carving and weaving, at toolmaking and food preparation, developing competencies they would need as adults. Winter became workshop and classroom combined, the time when cultural knowledge transferred from generation to generation through patient instruction and practice. Poetry and music flourished during winter confinement. Skalds composed new verses celebrating past deeds or mythological events, performed them to audiences with time to appreciate skilled wordplay and complex alliterative patterns. Simple instruments, bone flutes, and string devices provided accompaniment and solo entertainment. Singing helped pass time and lifted spirits, communal singing creating emotional bonds, shared musical experience reminding people they belong to the same culture, the same tradition, however dark the present moment. Storytelling was not just entertainment, but essential psychological medicine. The long sagas transported listeners away from smoky, cramped reality into worlds of adventure and honour, of heroes and gods, of battles and journeys. Children learned their culture's values through these stories. Adults reinforced their identities. Everyone escaped temporarily from winter's claustrophobic present. The stories also served a mnemonic function, preserving history and lore and genealogy in memorable narrative form, the oral tradition that maintained culture before literacy became widespread. Shared suffering created bonds that prosperity could not. People who survived winter together had experienced something profound, had depended on each other absolutely, had seen each other at worst and best. These bonds outlasted winter, created loyalties and obligations that shaped summer behaviour, influenced who people traded with or raided alongside, determined political alliances and military partnerships. Winter forged relationships that summer expressed through action, the social consequences extending far beyond the longhouse walls. The skills developed for winter survival transferred to other challenges. The patience required to endure months of darkness served Vikings well during long sea voyages. The conflict resolution mechanisms developed in cramped quarters worked in trading negotiations and legal assemblies. The ability to work cooperatively in difficult conditions enabled the group coordination necessary for successful raids or establishing new settlements. Winter taught skills that made Vikings effective in contexts that seemed unrelated, the domestic training ground for martial and mercantile success. When spring arrived and the household dispersed, the bonds forged in Firelight remained. People who had shared winter intimacy maintained relationships through summer's scattered activities, looked forward to or dreaded reunion the following winter, depending on how previous seasons had gone. The cyclical nature of gathering and dispersing created rhythm to Norse social life, the longhouse serving as anchor point, the place everyone returned to, the space where social bonds were maintained and reinforced through each winter's renewed proximity. The consequences of winter confinement thus rippled far beyond the immediate survival it made possible. It created social structures, developed cultural practices, forged bonds that defined Norse society at every level. The longhouse in winter was crucible, where human relationships were tested and refined, where cooperation was demanded and achieved or failed disastrously, where Vikings became who they were through the crucible of shared darkness and the fire that burned at the centre of everything. The architectural form of the longhouse influenced Norse culture in ways that extended far beyond its function as shelter, creating patterns of thought and behaviour that persisted even when Vikings left Scandinavia to settle across Europe and the North Atlantic. The building was not just where Vikings lived, but how they conceptualized community, hierarchy, hospitality, and the relationship between domestic and sacred space. Understanding the Longhouse means understanding Norse society at its foundation, the physical structure that shaped social structure in profound and lasting ways. The concept of household as fundamental social unit derived directly from Longhouse architecture. One building held one extended family with their dependents, this physical reality defining who belonged together, who shared resources and responsibilities, who owed loyalty to each other. The household was not abstract but concrete, bounded by walls everyone could see and touch, the building itself marking the limits of the most important social group. This architectural definition of community persisted in Norse culture long after specific building forms changed. Hospitality became sacred obligation partly because the Longhouse made hosting possible and necessary. Travellers in winter needed shelter, or they died. The harsh reality of northern climate meant that refusing hospitality was condemning people to death. The Longhouse had space for guests, benches where they could sit and sleep, food stores that could stretch to include unexpected mouths. The architecture enabled the moral system that made survival possible, physical space allowing for social practices that Norse culture elevated to religious duty. The high seat as architectural feature created a visible focus for authority, a place that marked who held power, a position that everyone could see and understand. This was not abstract leadership but embodied authority. The most important person literally sat higher than others, occupied the most honoured position, received service first. The architecture made hierarchy visible and constant, embedded status differences into everyday experience, reinforced social order through spatial arrangement that required no verbal assertion. The Longhouse influenced Norse concepts of wealth and display. A large longhouse demonstrated prosperity and power, the ability to maintain a big household, to house many dependents, to host elaborate gatherings. The building itself became status symbol, its size and decoration reflecting the owner's position. This linked architectural ambition to social ambition, made building a way of demonstrating success, created pressure to expand and improve longhouses as fortunes grew. The physical structure was simultaneously residence and advertisement, practical shelter and social statement. The communal nature of longhouse living shaped Norse attitudes toward privacy and individualism. Modern Western culture values privacy highly, considers it essential to human dignity, sees private space as fundamental right. Vikings lived differently. The longhouse offered almost no privacy. People slept in common spaces, conducted their lives under constant observation, developed cultural norms that accepted this as natural rather than oppressive. The lack of privacy in architecture reflected and reinforced cultural values that prioritized community over individual, that saw constant social interaction as desirable rather than burdensome. The religious significance of the high seat pillars, often carved with sacred imagery or dedicated to gods, meant that the longhouse itself had religious function. The building was not purely secular but partook of the sacred. The home was also a temple. Daily life unfolded in space that honoured gods and received their protection. This integration of domestic and religious space shaped Norse religion, prevented the sharp separation between sacred and profane that characterized Christian practice, created worldview where gods inhabited everyday life rather than being confined to special buildings and occasions. The longhouse as production centre influenced Norse economic organisation. Households were not just consumption units, but production units, nearly self-sufficient, making most of what they needed, trading surplus for what they could not make. This household-based economy meant that the building was simultaneously home and workshop and warehouse, that economic life centred on domestic space, that production and reproduction were not separate spheres but integrated activities. The architecture supported this integration by providing space for multiple functions, the same roof covering living and working areas. The gender division of space within longhouses influenced broader Norse attitudes toward gender roles. Women's work concentrated around the loom and the hearth. Men's work involved movement between interior and exterior, going out to fields or forests or sea while women maintained the home base. The architecture both reflected and reinforced this division, provided physical manifestation of social categories, made gender roles seem natural and inevitable by embedding them in spatial arrangements. Yet the centrality of women's workspace within the longhouse also gave that work visibility and importance, created architectural recognition of women's economic contributions. The practice of sleeping on benches along walls influenced Norse furniture development and domestic arrangements. Beds as separate furniture pieces were rare. The architecture itself provided sleeping space, benches serving double function as seating during day and beds at night. This multifunctionality characterized Norse domestic culture more broadly, objects and spaces serving multiple purposes, flexibility and efficiency valued over specialization. The architectural arrangement shaped how Vikings thought about domestic objects and space utilization. The longhouse travelled with Vikings wherever they settled. In Iceland, in Greenland, in the Faroe Islands, in the Scottish Islands, in Normandy, in England and Ireland. Norse settlers built longhouses following Scandinavian patterns, adapted to local materials and conditions. The architecture was cultural marker, a way of making new places feel like home, of maintaining Norse identity in foreign lands. The persistence of longhouse forms showed the depth of cultural attachment to this architectural tradition. The building was not just practical shelter, but symbol of Norse identity. The decline of the longhouse in later medieval period reflected broader cultural changes. As Christianity spread, as trade increased, as society became more stratified, the old communal living patterns seemed less appropriate. Newer buildings divided space more, created private rooms, separated different functions, reflected changing values about privacy and domestic organization. But the longhouse remained in cultural memory, appearing in sagas and folklore, representing an idealized past, a connection to Viking Age ancestors, a time when values were clearer and life was harder but more authentic. The modern Scandinavian concept of hygge, that sense of cozy, comfortable togetherness, derives partly from longhouse tradition. The emphasis on gathering around the fire, on shared meals and stories, on creating warmth and light against external darkness, on community as source of comfort and security, all echo the longhouse experience. The architecture is gone, but the values it shaped persist. The cultural patterns developed in those smoky, crowded winter spaces still influencing how Scandinavians think about home and hospitality and the good life. Archaeological preservation of longhouses allowed modern connection to Viking past that would otherwise be impossible. Visiting reconstructed longhouses or seeing excavated remains makes Viking Age visceral rather than abstract, lets people experience the scale and atmosphere of these spaces, understand how the architecture shaped daily life. This physical connection to the past influences modern Scandinavian identity, creates sense of continuity with ancestors, makes history tangible in ways that written sources cannot achieve. The longhouse impact thus extends from Viking Age to present, from Scandinavia to every place Norse culture touched, from practical matters of shelter and survival to abstract realms of identity and memory. The building was not just box for living, but template for society, shaping how Vikings organized themselves, how they thought about community and authority and home, leaving legacy that persists in unexpected ways, in cultural values and social patterns and architectural traditions that trace their origins to that long, dark room with its central fire and surrounding benches, that space where Vikings became who they were through the simple act of surviving winter together. Stepping back from archaeology and architecture and social theory, from the abstract analysis of spatial organization and economic systems, we need to remember that longhouses were full of people, individuals with names and personalities, with hopes and fears and daily concerns that shaped their experience more than any historical pattern we might identify from outside. These were not generic Vikings living stereotypical Norse lives, but specific human beings negotiating specific circumstances, their voices mostly lost but occasionally preserved in fragments that let us glimpse the human reality behind the historical reconstruction. The matriarch managing a longhouse carried weight that Saga descriptions of powerful women only hint at. She rose before dawn even in winter darkness, checked food stores, calculated whether supplies would last, decided who got how much at each meal. She supervised textile production, assigned spinning and weaving work, inspected finished cloth, judged quality. She tended the sick, treated injuries with herbs and prayers, sat with the dying. She mediated disputes between household members, kept peace, maintained social harmony. She trained young women in skills they would need, passed down knowledge accumulated through lifetime of managing domestic economy. Her authority was real and constant, her decisions affecting everyone, her burden heavy even when history would not record her name. The skald, the professional poet, held honoured position in wealthy households, his skill with words valued as highly as any warrior's prowess with weapons. He memorised thousands of lines of complex verse, performed for hours without notes, his voice filling the longhouse with stories of gods and heroes, with praise poems for his patron, with satirical verses about enemies. But he was also just a man who got tired and hoarse, who forgot lines sometimes and improvised, who worried whether his compositions would please, whether his position was secure, whether younger skalds might replace him. His art was his survival, his memory, his wealth, his tongue, his sword. The child listening to stories by firelight, eyes wide with wonder, absorbing cultural knowledge through repetition and rhythm, learning language's full potential, memorizing plots and characters without conscious effort. This child might be free or enslaved, might be destined for greatness or doomed to anonymity, but in that moment of listening, in that transportation into narrative world, status mattered less than story. The sagas would survive because children listened, because each generation learned and passed on, because the oral tradition found willing vessels in young minds eager for escape from winter's darkness. The thrall carried firewood, endlessly, arms aching, back straining, the same task repeated day after day because the fire could never die, because free people did not carry their own wood when slaves could do it. This person had a name that no one remembered, had come from somewhere as captive, had family somewhere who might be dead or enslaved or free and wandering, had thoughts and feelings that mattered to no one, performed essential labour that enabled the household's survival while receiving minimum food and maximum hardship, slept near the cold door, wore the worst clothes, got the scraps after everyone else ate, lived a life the sagas barely acknowledged except as background detail, as property rather than person. The pregnant woman through another winter, feeling the child grow inside her while worrying about surviving childbirth, knowing that many women died bringing life into the world, that no medical help existed beyond midwives with uncertain knowledge. She worked through pregnancy because work never stopped, spun wool with increasingly awkward movements, helped prepare food, though smells made her nauseated, tried to preserve strength for the ordeal ahead. She prayed to Freya for safe delivery, made offerings, sought charms and protections, did everything the culture offered while knowing it might not be enough. The warrior home from raiding, restless through winter confinement, bored by domestic routine after the intensity of violent adventure. He sat by the fire sharpening weapons that would not be used for months, telling stories of battles and plunder, maintaining identity as fighter when current reality was farmer. He trained younger men in weaponcraft, passed on skills that most would never use but all needed to learn. He struggled with the transition between warrior self and domestic self, the contradiction never quite resolved, both identities real but incompatible, the longhouse requiring one version of him while his reputation demanded another. The elderly woman who had seen 60 winters, ancient by Viking standards, her hands twisted by arthritis but still able to spin, her eyes dim but memory clear. She remembered when the longhouse was built, had helped raise the timbers, had seen children born who were now grandparents themselves. She was repository of family history, knew genealogies going back generations, could settle disputes about inheritance and precedent. She dozed by the fire, woke to add her voice to discussions, commanded respect because she had survived when so many died, her age itself demonstration of strength and worth. The young man courting the Jarl's daughter, trying to prove his worth, performing small services, displaying skill at carving or gaming, hoping to be noticed favourably. He sat near her on the benches when he could, tried to catch her eye, wondered if she returned his interest or tolerated his attention only. Marriage would improve his status, bring property and alliance, secure his future. But would her father accept his suit? Did he have enough wealth, enough reputation? The uncertainty gnawed at him through the long winter evenings. The midwife called to a difficult birth, her bag of herbs and tools ready. Her knowledge accumulated through years of attending labouring women. She had seen births that went smoothly, and births that ended in tragedy, knew which signs meant danger, which positions helped delivery, which herbs might help or harm. She prayed while she worked, called on goddesses, used every skill she possessed while knowing that ultimately birth was beyond full human control, that sometimes mother and child both died despite best efforts. The trader who had travelled to Constantinople, who had seen the great city and returned with stories no one quite believed, silks and silver and tales of wonders. He sat in the longhouse spinning narratives of foreign marvels, of huge stone buildings and thousands of people, of wealth beyond imagination, of foods and customs strange beyond comprehension. People listened half-believing, wanting to be transported, envying and doubting in equal measure, the longhouse suddenly feeling small and provincial and limiting. The woman weaving at her loom, hands moving in practiced patterns, barely watching the work because muscle memory controlled the motion, her mind free to wander while her fingers created value thread by thread. She thought about the cloth she was making, about the trade goods it would bring, about the dress she wanted for her daughter, about the repairs needed in the house, about 100 things while the weaving continued automatically, proof of skill so ingrained it required no conscious thought. These were the voices from the benches, mostly silent now, their individual stories lost except in rare fragments. But they were there, filling the longhouse with personality and drama, with ordinary concerns and extraordinary moments, with the full spectrum of human experience compressed into one smoky space. The Archaeology reveals the space they occupied, the Sagas preserve cultural patterns they enacted, but the individuals themselves remain mostly beyond reach, ghosts around a fire that burned out centuries ago, people who lived and loved and worried and died, whose names are forgotten, but whose humanity persists in the structure of the life they built, in the spaces they occupied, in the cultural patterns they maintained through all those long winter nights by the fire. The romantic image of the longhouse as cosy refuge from winter cold obscures a harsher reality. 30 or 40 people confined together for months, in a space perhaps 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, living in semi-darkness and perpetual smoke, navigating complicated hierarchies and personal animosities with no possibility of escape, facing the constant pressure of limited resources and uncertain survival. This was not harmonious community but pressure cooker of competing interests and inevitable conflicts. The Sagas preserve stories of violence erupting from winter tensions, of feuds born in close quarters, of social mechanisms strained to breaking point by the simple impossibility of avoiding people you hated. Honour disputes festered particularly dangerously in the confined longhouse. An insult delivered in summer might be answered immediately, the offended party challenging the insulter, violence resolving the matter quickly if brutally. But in winter, when fighting inside the longhouse risked burning it down or splitting the household during the season, when unity meant survival, insults had to be endured, resentment building day after day as the victim sat across the fire from the offender, forced to share meals and stories and space with someone who had impugned their reputation. The Sagas describe men driven to murder by accumulated slights, by dishonour that gnawed at them through dark months until spring released them to violent resolution. The household head faced the thankless task of managing these tensions. Every decision about resource allocation created resentment from those who felt slighted. Every judgment in a dispute made an enemy of the losing party. The authority to command came with the burden of maintaining peace among people, with competing interests and no escape from each other. Weak leadership meant the household divided into factions, feuds erupting into violence that could destroy everyone. Strong leadership meant making unpopular decisions and enduring the hatred of those who disagreed, bearing the weight of resentment while trying to keep everyone alive until spring. Women's disputes operated in different register but with equal intensity. Competition over status, over whose cloth was finest, over whose children were most promising, over proximity to the fire or precedence in serving meals, all the small social distinctions that marked hierarchy among women. These became battlegrounds during winter when there was nothing else to occupy minds and too much time to nurse grievances. The Sagas describe women as instigators of violence, goading men to avenge insults, using masculine honour codes to pursue their own feuds, manipulating the social system to destructive ends. Generational conflicts added their own tensions. Young people chafed under the authority of elders, wanted their chance at leadership, resented the conservative caution that age brought to decision-making. Old people feared losing status and authority, worried about being pushed aside, defended their positions against ambitious youth. The Longhouse forced these tensions into constant proximity, the ambitious young man sitting night after night near the old Jarl whose death would elevate him, the unspoken anticipation of mortality poisoning their relationship, making every interaction fraught with implication. Sexual tensions complicated everything. Young people in close quarters, hormones and attractions operating without privacy or much opportunity for legitimate expression, created situations ripe for conflict. Adultery was possible despite crowding, perhaps inevitable given the proximity and the months of winter darkness. Discovery of affairs could ignite feuds that destroyed households, honour demanded violence, betrayed spouses sought vengeance, the whole community forced to take sides in disputes that affected everyone. The sagas are full of such stories, suggesting they reflected real problems that communal living created or exacerbated. The presence of thralls created its own category of tension. Free household members competed for status among themselves, but all agreed they were superior to slaves. Yet living in such proximity to enslaved people, seeing their humanity despite the legal categories that denied it, created cognitive dissonance that some resolved through cruelty, reasserting the hierarchy through violence, treating thralls badly to convince themselves the distinction was real and justified. Others developed relationships with thralls that crossed the legal boundaries, friendships or sexual liaisons that threatened the social order, creating scandals when discovered. Resource scarcity intensified every other tension. When food stores ran low, when it became clear the household had miscalculated winter preparations, every meal became potential flashpoint. Who got how much? Whether portions were fair? Whether the powerful were hoarding while the weak went hungry? These questions could tear households apart. The household head faced impossible choices, reducing everyone's rations equally or protecting the most important members, either decision creating resentment and accusations of unfairness. Children caught in adult disputes suffered particularly. They witnessed violence, absorbed hatred, learned that feuds mattered more than peace, that honour justified killing. They were also used as pawns, their marriages arranged to settle disputes or cement alliances, their futures sacrificed to adult concerns. Some children internalized the feuds of their parents, carrying grudges into the next generation, perpetuating cycles of violence that the Longhouse's close quarters had initiated. Disease added terror to tension. In crowded conditions with poor sanitation, illness spread rapidly. A cough or fever in one person became epidemic, threatening everyone. No effective medicine existed. People died from infections that modern antibiotics cure easily. The household could only isolate the sick in whatever limited way the space allowed, and hope the disease would not kill too many. The fear of contagion made people cruel, sometimes excluding the sick from the fire's warmth, denying them food, hastening their death to protect the healthy. Mental illness, whether depression from the long darkness or more serious conditions, received no treatment and little understanding. Someone exhibiting erratic behavior was frightening in close quarters, their actions unpredictable, their presence destabilizing. The household had few options. Restraint if the person became violent, tolerance if they were merely difficult, exile if the problem became unbearable, though exile in winter was death sentence. The sagas mention madness matter-of-factly, suggesting it was common enough to be unremarkable, the Longhouse environment perhaps triggering or exacerbating conditions that would manifest less severely in other circumstances. Religious differences could create divisions. As Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia, households might contain both pagans and Christians, their competing cosmologies and practices creating friction. Christians refused to participate in sacrifices to the old gods. Pagans mocked Christian practices, each side certain the other was inviting divine punishment that would destroy everyone. Families split over religion, children converting while parents remained pagan, or vice versa, the household becoming battleground for cosmic disputes about salvation and proper worship. Legal disputes that could not be resolved during winter had to be held in abeyance until spring assemblies, but the parties to the dispute still had to live together through the dark months. The accuser and accused sat across the fire from each other, the plaintiff and defendant ate at the same table, forced into intimacy while waiting for justice. This created situations of unbearable tension, violence sometimes erupting despite the prohibition, the pressure of unresolved legal conflict too much to endure in such proximity. The opposition within longhouses thus took many forms, from the dramatic violence preserved in sagas to the quiet daily friction of incompatible personalities forced into constant proximity, from honour feuds to sexual jealousies, from generational conflicts to religious divisions, from competition over scarce resources to the simple human inability to get along with everyone all the time. The longhouse survived these tensions through social mechanisms designed to manage conflict, through hierarchy that imposed order, through customs that channeled antagonism into acceptable forms, through the shared recognition that winter survival required cooperation, however difficult that cooperation might be to maintain. But the mechanisms sometimes failed. Longhouses burned with people inside, whether by accident or intent. Households split apart, members fleeing even in winter rather than endure continued proximity to enemies. Men killed each other over insults, or women or inheritance. Families feuded for generations over disputes that began in cramped winter quarters. The dark side of communal living left its mark in saga violence and archaeological destruction layers, evidence that the opposition within these walls was sometimes too powerful to contain, that the pressure cooker exploded, that winter's forced intimacy could destroy as well as bond, depending on who the people were and how well they managed the impossible task of living together without escape, through the long dark months when the world outside the longhouse was frozen death, and the world inside was all there was. The Vikings did not merely endure winter, they transformed it, turned months of potential despair into productive time, developed cultural practices that made darkness bearable and even meaningful, created art and craft and story that justified the struggle, and gave winter purpose beyond simple survival. This awakening to winter's possibilities, this refusal to let the darkness be only darkness, represented one of Norse culture's most significant achievements, a victory of human creativity over environmental limitation. The craft production that filled winter days was not merely utilitarian but aesthetic. The bone combs carved during long evenings were functional objects, yes, but they were also beautiful, decorated with intricate geometric patterns or animal motifs, the carver taking pride in transforming ordinary tool into art. The same was true of knife handles and spoons, of weaving tools and children's toys, of everything made during winter's enforced indoor time. Vikings could have made crude functional objects quickly and moved on to other tasks. Instead, they chose to invest hours in decoration and refinement, to create beauty because beauty mattered, because the long dark was more bearable when surrounded by well-crafted things. Textile production became art form during winter. The basic task was simple: turn wool into thread, thread into cloth, cloth into clothing and trade goods. But the execution allowed infinite variation. Dyes created colours, patterns emerged from different weaving techniques, borders and decorations showed skill and creativity. A woman could weave plain cloth quickly, or invest extra time creating something distinctive and beautiful. The choice to do the latter, repeated across thousands of winter projects, created the elaborate textile tradition that archaeology reveals, the Norse commitment to craft excellence, even in domestic production. The poetry created and performed during winter nights represents some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated literary achievement. Skaldic verse used complex alliterative patterns, intricate metaphors called kennings, rigid metrical structures that required tremendous skill to master. Composing such poetry was intellectual exercise of highest order, comparable to composing music or solving mathematical puzzles, requiring years of training and natural talent. The fact that Vikings invested in this art form, supported professional poets, valued complex verse enough to memorize hours of it, shows cultural sophistication that contradicts the simple warrior stereotype. The sagas themselves, though written down later, were composed orally during winter performances, storytellers developing elaborate narratives that could take multiple evenings to complete. These were not simple fairy tales, but complex multi-generational narratives dealing with themes of honour and revenge, family obligation and personal ambition, fate and free will, the great questions that humans everywhere ponder. The saga tradition elevated storytelling to art, created narrative structures that scholars still study, preserved cultural memory through literary techniques sophisticated enough to transcend its oral origins. Visual art flourished within the constraints of available materials. The carved decoration on longhouse posts and furniture, on everyday objects and prestige goods, developed distinctive Norse styles, intricate interlacing patterns, and stylized animals that spread across the Viking world. These patterns required no functionality, served only aesthetic purposes, existed because Vikings valued beauty and dedicated precious winter hours to creating it. The consistency of these decorative traditions across Scandinavia and Norse settlements suggests they were taught systematically, that masters instructed apprentices, that artistic knowledge passed down through generations. Music provided another winter outlet. Simple instruments, bone flutes, and string devices allowed both individual practice and group performance. Singing was probably more common than instrumental music, songs accompanying work or providing entertainment. Communal singing, creating social bonds through shared performance. The melodies are lost, no notation survived, but saga references to songs and modern Scandinavian folk traditions suggest the Norse had rich musical culture, another art form that made winter bearable. Games of strategy like Tafel were not merely time-wasting but intellectual development. The game required planning and tactical thinking, skills that transferred to other domains, warfare and trade and political maneuvering. Young people learned strategic reasoning through play, developed ability to think several moves ahead, to anticipate opponents' actions, to balance risk and caution. The game boards found in wealthy graves suggest that skill at such games conferred status, that mental agility was valued alongside physical prowess. The development of legal and political thinking probably accelerated during winter gatherings. Men who would attend summer assemblies used winter to discuss legal precedents, to debate interpretations of custom, to plan political strategies. The elaborate legal system that characterized Norse society, with its detailed procedures for arbitration and compensation, its careful attention to precedent and proper form, developed partly through these winter discussions, men with time to think working through the complexities of maintaining social order without centralized authority. Religious and philosophical thought deepened during winter's contemplative months. The cosmology preserved in later sources, the complex mythology of gods and giants, fate and chaos, the 9 worlds and the world tree. This sophisticated religious thought developed through generations of winter meditation and discussion. The questions about fate and free will, about honor and death, about the nature of courage and the meaning of life, these were not answered simply, but explored through mythology and poetry, through the stories told and retold during dark months. Innovation in practical domains also occurred during winter. Shipbuilders refined designs during months when they could not build, planning improvements to be implemented when weather allowed. Farmers developed new techniques for crop rotation or animal husbandry, shared knowledge with neighbours, built up agricultural expertise that made settlements more viable. Craftspeople experimented with new methods, tested different approaches, refined their skills through winter practice that led to summer implementation. The transmission of knowledge across generations intensified during winter. Old people taught young, masters instructed apprentices, parents trained children, the accumulated wisdom of culture passing down through demonstration and practice and story. Winter was school year, the time when next generation learned what they needed to know, when cultural continuity was maintained through deliberate instruction. The Longhouse was classroom, the curriculum was survival and culture combined. The graduation was successfully reaching another spring. The awakening to winter's possibilities transformed what could have been merely grim endurance into something richer, creative, productive time that built culture even as it maintained life. The Vikings emerged from winter not just alive but enriched, with new cloth and tools, with new skills and stories, with strengthened social bonds and refined cultural knowledge. They had turned darkness into opportunity, made art from necessity, created meaning from survival, and in doing so demonstrated human capacity to thrive, not just survive, to find purpose and beauty even in the most constrained and difficult circumstances. This awakening was not individual but collective, not one person deciding to make winter meaningful, but entire culture developing practices and traditions that transformed seasonal necessity into cultural achievement. The Longhouse was crucible where this transformation occurred, the space that enabled winter gathering, the architecture that made cultural transmission possible, the shelter within which Vikings created the art and craft and story and thought that made them who they were. When we marvel at Viking achievement, at their ships and raids and settlements across impossible distances, we should remember that those achievements rested on foundation built during winter nights, in dark, smoky longhouses, where patient craft and careful thought and cultural transmission happened far from glory's spotlight, making possible everything that came after. At the centre of every longhouse, at the heart of Norse domestic life, at the core of winter survival and cultural transmission, burned the fire. Not metaphorically, but literally, flames fed with precious wood or peat, tended day and night through months of darkness, source of warmth and light and life itself. To understand the longhouse is to understand the fire, not just as practical necessity, but as symbol and reality combined, as physical phenomenon and cultural meaning, as the element that made everything else possible, and thus came to represent everything Vikings valued about home and community and survival. The fire was never allowed to die. This was not preference but necessity. Restarting a fire in winter when everything was damp required tremendous effort and valuable resources. Flint and steel and dry tinder, patience and skill and time. Letting the fire die meant hours or days of cold while struggling to restart it, meant wasting fuel, meant demonstrating incompetence in the most basic household duty. Every member of the household understood this. Children learned early to tend flames, to add wood at proper intervals, to bank the fire at night so it would smoulder through until morning when it could be rebuilt for the day. But the fire's continuity meant more than practical convenience. A fire that burned through generations connected present to past, the same flames warming great-grandchildren that had warmed their ancestors, the continuity of fire representing continuity of family and culture. When a household abandoned a farm, when a line died out, when a longhouse was deliberately destroyed, the fire was allowed to die, its extinction marking the end of something greater than heat and light, the ending of a lineage or a way of life. The smoke from the fire preserved the longhouse structure, impregnating the wood with chemicals that prevented rot and insect damage, extending the building's life far beyond what untreated timber could achieve. This preservation was not incidental but essential. The smoke that made breathing difficult also made survival possible, protecting the massive investment of labour that the longhouse represented. Vikings understood this even if they did not understand the chemistry, knew that smoky interiors lasted while well-ventilated structures rotted, chose durability over comfort, because durability meant survival. The fire's light structured time when darkness made natural rhythms irrelevant. Rising meant building up the fire, banking it meant preparing for sleep, the cycle of flame and ember marking days when dawn and dusk were indistinguishable. The fire imposed order on chaos, gave structure to time that winter tried to erase, maintained human rhythms in the face of natural darkness that would otherwise dissolve all temporal distinctions into undifferentiated night. The hearth as sacred space appears in Norse religion and mythology, the fire representing one of the fundamental forces, neither good nor evil but necessary and dangerous, requiring respect and constant attention. Gods were honoured at the hearth, offerings burned there, oaths sworn there, the fire witnessing and validating human ritual. The religion did not separate sacred from domestic. The longhouse fire was simultaneously cooking fire and altar fire, the distinction meaningless in worldview that saw divine presence everywhere rather than confined to temples. The social organisation of the longhouse radiated from the fire. The high seat was near the fire. The most honoured positions were near the fire. Status correlated directly with proximity to warmth and light. This was not arbitrary, but reflected practical reality. Those near the fire were warm and could see clearly. Those far from the fire were cold and worked in darkness. Social hierarchy mapped onto physical comfort, made inequality visible and constant, reinforced status through daily experience of differential access to basic needs. The fire as gathering point created the social intimacy that characterized longhouse life. Everyone oriented toward the flames, faced each other across the hearth, the circular arrangement forcing eye contact and interaction, making it impossible to avoid social engagement. Modern houses allow retreat to private rooms, allow avoidance of difficult interactions. The longhouse fire prevented avoidance, demanded participation, created community through architectural arrangement that gave no alternative to togetherness. The stories told by Firelight took on special character because of the setting. The flames provided dramatic lighting, Faces illuminated from below, shadows dancing on walls, the visual atmosphere enhancing narrative performance. The warmth made listeners comfortable and receptive. The darkness beyond the firelight created focus on the story and the teller. The crackling of the fire provided background rhythm. The context shaped the content. Stories were composed for fireside telling, used techniques that worked in that setting, created effects that depended on flames and shadows and gathered listeners. The fire's danger was ever present. A building made largely of wood and thatch could burn catastrophically if flames escaped the hearth. The fear of fire-shaped behaviour. Everyone understood the need for caution. Children learned young to respect the flames, to tend them carefully, to never let them spread beyond their stone boundaries. The sagas preserve accounts of longhouses burning, sometimes accidentally but often intentionally, enemies setting fires to destroy households, the occupants burning to death or fleeing into winter cold. The fire that sustained life could also end it. The duality was inherent and inescapable. The fuel for the fire represented stored solar energy, summer's growth converted to winter's warmth, trees or peat that had captured sunlight now releasing it as heat and light. Vikings might not have understood photosynthesis, but they grasped the fundamental trade. Summer's labour gathering wood paid for winter's warmth, the seasonal cycle mediated through the transformation of plant matter into flame. The fire connected seasons, made summer's plenty available during winter's scarcity, transformed time into heat. The ashes from the fire had practical uses, spread on fields as fertilizer, mixed with fat to make soap, used in various chemical processes that depended on alkaline materials. Nothing was wasted. Even the residue from burning served purposes. The household economy extracting value from every material, the fire producing useful byproducts beyond its primary functions of warmth and light and cooking. The fire's needs structured household labour. Gathering fuel was constant task. Processing wood through cutting and splitting and drying, transporting it to storage, feeding it to flames, removing ashes, the cycle never ending. This labour fell disproportionately on thralls and children, the lowest status household members performing the most essential tasks. Another contradiction the Norse seemed not to notice, or at least not to question, the fundamental importance of the work not translating to status for those who did it. The revelation the fire teaches is simple and profound. Survival requires constant attention to basics, warmth and light, and community cannot be taken for granted, but must be actively maintained through conscious effort and shared responsibility. The fire that went untended died. The household that neglected its hearth perished. The metaphor was also literal truth. Inattention meant death in the real and immediate sense. This made Vikings pragmatic and careful, made them value reliability over brilliance, made them understand that dramatic achievements meant nothing if basic maintenance was neglected. The fire also reveals that meaning and necessity can coincide, that the same thing can be both symbol and reality, that poetry and practicality are not opposed but intertwined. The Norse did not choose between viewing the fire as sacred symbol or practical tool. It was both simultaneously, the division meaningless in their worldview. This integration of practical and spiritual, of necessity and meaning, characterized Norse culture more broadly, a refusal to separate domains that modern thought tends to keep distinct. The Longhouse fire burned for centuries, fed by generations, warming countless people through countless winters, witnessing births and deaths, stories and silences, celebrations and tragedies, the full spectrum of human experience played out in its light and warmth. When the Viking Age ended, when the old ways died and new cultures replaced them, the fires went out, the longhouses fell into ruin, the buildings returned to earth from which their materials came. But the fire's lesson persists, carried forward in cultural memory and archaeological evidence, in the recognition that community gathers around warmth, that light drives back darkness, that tending the flames that sustain life is humanity's most ancient and essential task, as true now as it was then, as meaningful in modern context as it was in smoky Norse longhouses, where the fire burned and life continued against all the world's cold darkness. Stand back from the archaeological evidence and the saga accounts, from the reconstructed longhouses and the academic debates, from all the scholarly apparatus we use to understand Viking domestic life, and ask what the longhouse means for us now, for people living in centrally heated homes with electric lights and private bedrooms, with grocery stores and hospitals and all the infrastructure that makes modern life comfortable and safe. What can we learn from the Vikings who huddled around fires through dark winters, who lived in close quarters without privacy, who survived through skills and knowledge we have mostly forgotten? The answer is both humbling and relevant, a mirror that reflects what we have gained and what we have lost. The Longhouse teaches about the fundamental human need for community. We have built society that values independence and self-sufficiency, that celebrates individual achievement and personal space, that considers privacy essential to dignity and autonomy. These values bring real benefits: freedom from oppressive social control, protection from collective tyranny, space for individual development. But we have also created loneliness epidemic, millions of people living alone, isolated from meaningful social connection, suffering from lack of community in ways Vikings would have found incomprehensible. The Longhouse model was extreme in the opposite direction: too much togetherness, insufficient privacy, but it ensured that no one was alone, that community support was automatic, that human connection was constant if sometimes suffocating. The balance between individual and community that the Longhouse enforced was different from our balance. Neither better nor worse, but adapted to different circumstances and priorities. Vikings needed communal survival strategies that we do not. Their environment demanded cooperation that modern infrastructure makes optional. We can afford individualism because our technology provides safety net that they lacked. But perhaps we have gone too far. Perhaps recovering some element of mandatory community, of being needed by and needing others, would address the isolation that modern life creates. The Longhouse also teaches about resilience and preparedness. Vikings survived because they prepared thoroughly, because they understood their environment's challenges and adapted systematically to meet them, because they took responsibility for their own survival rather than depending on external systems to save them. Modern society has created elaborate infrastructure that provides security and comfort, that rescues us from our mistakes, that makes preparation optional for most people most of the time. This is progress, certainly, but it has also made us fragile, dependent on systems we do not understand and cannot maintain individually. When those systems fail, as they occasionally do during natural disasters or infrastructure breakdowns, modern people often struggle because we have lost the skills and mindset that made Vikings capable. We do not know how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to stay warm without central heating, how to entertain ourselves without electricity, how to maintain health without immediate medical access. The specific skills are less important than the general capability, the confidence that we can handle challenges, that we possess knowledge sufficient to survive disruption. The Longhouse model assumed nothing could be taken for granted, that survival required constant vigilance and competence, a mindset we have largely abandoned and might benefit from partially recovering. The Longhouse confronts us with hard questions about inequality and hierarchy. Viking society was not egalitarian. The Longhouse made inequality architecturally explicit, different people receiving different treatment based on status they did not choose and could not change. We find this offensive. Our egalitarian values reject the assumption that some people matter more than others, that servants and slaves should suffer cold and hunger so that their masters can be comfortable. Yet our society still tolerates vast inequality. We simply hide it better, separate the privileged from the struggling through geographic segregation, rather than spatial hierarchy within shared buildings. Is this actually more moral, or just less honest? The Longhouse forced privileged and disadvantaged to share space, to see each other's humanity despite the social categories that separated them. Modern inequality allows the wealthy to avoid ever seeing poverty, allows comfortable people to ignore those who struggle, creates moral distance that makes indifference easier. Perhaps there is something to be said for the Longhouse model that required social classes to interact daily, that made inequality visible and personal rather than abstract and distant. It did not eliminate injustice, but it at least made injustice impossible to ignore. The relationship between work and meaning that the Longhouse embodied challenges modern assumptions. Vikings worked constantly, their labour directly connected to survival, every task necessary, every skill valuable. Modern technology has eliminated much necessary labour, freed us from the grinding toil that filled Viking lives, given us leisure time our ancestors could barely imagine. Yet we struggle with meaning, with finding purpose in work that seems arbitrary, with justifying existence when survival is automatic. The longhouse model offers no solution to this problem, but it clarifies the trade. We have gained comfort and lost necessity, have achieved security and lost urgency, have created abundance and lost the clarity of purpose that scarcity provides. The longhouse relationship with darkness and light resonates in age of artificial illumination. Vikings lived with darkness as fundamental reality. The long winter night was not inconvenience but defining condition. They adapted to it rather than trying to eliminate it. Modern society treats darkness as a problem to be solved through technology. We flood our environments with light, work, and shop, and entertain ourselves at all hours, rarely experience true darkness. The benefits are obvious, but we have also lost something: the natural rhythms that darkness imposed, the forced rest and reflection, the intimacy that gathered firelight created. The emphasis on storytelling and oral tradition in the longhouse offers perspective on modern media consumption. Vikings told and listened to stories as active participants. The narrative tradition required memory and performance, engaged people intellectually and emotionally. Modern media is passive consumption. We watch and listen but rarely create. The stories come from distant sources and require no effort from us beyond attention. The longhouse model suggests that participating in storytelling, creating and maintaining narrative tradition, might be more meaningful than consuming professionally produced content, that the process matters as much as the product. The longhouse teaches that comfort and growth are not always compatible. The difficult conditions of winter confinement forced Vikings to develop impressive skills, elaborate culture, sophisticated social mechanisms. They became who they were partly through responding to challenges that modern people would consider unacceptable. This does not mean we should artificially create hardship, but it suggests that some difficulty, some challenges that require real effort to overcome, might be necessary for human flourishing in ways that pure comfort cannot provide. The reverence for the eternal hearth, for the fire that connected generations, speaks to our rootlessness. Modern people move frequently, live far from family, have no connection to places our ancestors inhabited, no continuity with past beyond what we consciously maintain. The longhouse fire burning through generations created literal warmth, but also metaphorical warmth, connection to past and future, sense of belonging to something larger than individual existence. We have gained mobility and lost rootedness, have achieved freedom and lost continuity. The trade-off neither simply good nor simply bad, but laden with consequences we are still discovering. What the longhouse means for us, finally, is that different ways of living create different kinds of people, that our comfortable modern existence shapes us just as the harsh, longhouse life shaped Vikings, that no arrangement is perfect, but all have trade-offs, that understanding past possibilities might help us think more clearly about present choices. We cannot and should not try to recreate Viking domestic life, but we can learn from it, can see what we have gained and lost, can make conscious decisions about what aspects of community and resilience and meaning we want to preserve, or recover or develop, in new forms suited to modern circumstances. The longhouse is gone, the fires are cold, the people are dust, but the questions they faced about how to live well together, how to survive with dignity, how to create meaning and maintain humanity in difficult circumstances, these questions persist, and the answers they found, partial and flawed as they were, still have something to teach us if we are willing to learn. The archaeological excavations continue. Each summer brings new discoveries, new longhouses emerging from Scandinavian soil, from Icelandic peat, from the permafrost of abandoned Greenland settlements. Each site adds detail to our understanding, refines the picture, answers some questions while raising others. The work is patient and slow, the same careful methods applied season after season, the gradual accumulation of knowledge that characterizes archaeology at its best. The longhouses wait beneath the earth, ready to reveal their secrets to anyone willing to dig carefully and interpret thoughtfully. The reconstructed longhouses draw visitors by the thousands, experimental archaeology projects where people can walk through replicas built using ancient techniques, can sit on the benches and imagine the smoke and crowding, can begin to grasp what life might have been like in these spaces. Some reconstructions are careful and scholarly, based on the best archaeological evidence, precise in their details. Others are more romantic and less accurate, giving visitors the atmosphere if not the exact reality. All serve valuable purpose, making Viking domestic life tangible rather than abstract, creating visceral connection to the past that written descriptions cannot achieve. In Scandinavia, the longhouse remains cultural touchstone, symbol of heritage and identity, reminder of ancestors who survived impossible conditions and built culture that still shapes modern Nordic societies. Museums feature longhouse exhibits, schools teach children about Viking domestic life, cultural festivals include demonstrations of ancient crafts practiced in recreated longhouse settings. The building is gone, but its meaning persists, carried forward through deliberate cultural memory, through choice to remember and honour rather than forget. The modern Scandinavian concept of home owes debt to longhouse tradition, even when the architecture has changed completely. The emphasis on creating warm, welcoming domestic spaces, on gathering around fire or candlelight, on the sacred quality of home as refuge from external harshness, all echo the longhouse values. Hygge, that Danish word for cosy contentment that has entered international vocabulary, captures something of the longhouse spirit. The creation of warmth and intimacy against darkness and cold. The transformation of necessity into pleasure. The elevation of domestic comfort to philosophical principle. The longhouse legacy extends beyond Scandinavia to everywhere Vikings settled. In Iceland, where the old culture persisted longest and saga tradition remained vital, the longhouse left a particularly deep imprint, influencing not just domestic architecture but social organisation and cultural values into the modern era. Icelandic farms retained elements of longhouse design into the 20th century, turf walls and communal spaces, connection to past maintained through conservative building traditions. The scholarship around longhouses continues evolving, new theoretical frameworks bringing new interpretations, new technologies revealing new data, the conversation between past and present ongoing and productive. What once seemed settled becomes controversial again. What was ignored gains new significance. The dead Vikings and their vanished homes provoking endless discussion among the living scholars who study them. This is as it should be. The questions worth asking rarely have simple final answers. The work of understanding is never complete. The fire at the heart of it all, the eternal hearth, carries meaning that transcends its historical specificity. Every culture that survived winter darkness had some version of the gathered fire, the communal warmth, the light against the dark. The longhouse hearth was Viking expression of universal human need, particular in its details but familiar in its essentials. We still gather around fires when we can, campfires and fireplaces, candles and hearths, something deep responding to flames and warmth and the ancient association between fire and community and survival. The stories told by Viking firesides have not ended, we still tell them. In different forms certainly, but with the same core impulses. The need to make sense of existence, to connect past to present, to pass down wisdom and warnings, to entertain and instruct, to create meaning through narrative. The skalds are gone, but the stories they preserved survived, written down eventually, translated and retranslated, adapted and reimagined, still speaking to audiences who will never see a longhouse, but can recognize human experiences that transcend time and culture. The children who listened by the fire grew up and had children of their own, who listened and grew and continued the chain, generation after generation, until the Viking Age ended and became history rather than living culture. But the unbroken line of human transmission, of knowledge passed down, of culture maintained through teaching and learning, of children becoming adults who would teach the next children, this continues. The same process in different contexts. The fundamental mechanism of cultural survival operating now as it operated then. The longhouse in winter, the people gathered against the darkness, the fire burning steadily through the long, cold night. This image has power that endures beyond its historical moment. It speaks to something essential about human existence, our vulnerability and our resilience, our need for each other, and our difficulty living together, our capacity to create meaning and beauty even in harsh circumstances, our refusal to let darkness and cold have the final word. The specific world of the Viking Longhouse is lost. The last fires burned out centuries ago. The last people who knew that life as lived reality are dust and memory. We cannot recover what is gone, cannot truly know what it felt like to live through those winters, to sit on those benches, to tend those fires, to tell and hear those stories. Too much is lost, too much has changed. The gap between their experience and ours is vast and unbridgeable. Yet something survives. not the physical structures or the specific practices, but the human qualities they revealed and fostered. The courage to face difficulty without despair, the creativity to make beauty from necessity, the commitment to community even when community was burden as well as blessing, the ability to find meaning in ordinary survival, to transform daily tasks into cultural expression, to maintain hope and humanity through circumstances that tested both. These qualities are not uniquely Viking, but the Longhouse gives them particular expression, makes them visible and concrete, provides specific example of how humans can meet challenges and create culture simultaneously. The building itself is teaching tool, the archaeological remains are texts to be read, the stories preserve voices speaking across silence, and together they offer lessons about resilience and community, and the human capacity to endure. The eternal hearth burns still, not in physical longhouses, but in cultural memory and modern practice, in the values we have inherited and sometimes unknowingly honour, in the moments when we gather against darkness, when we create warmth together, when we tell stories and maintain traditions, when we recognise our fundamental need for community and meaning and light. The fire has travelled far from Viking longhouses, has been tended by countless hands, has illuminated different faces in different times. But it is the same fire, essentially, the human fire, the eternal hearth, where we gather to survive and to become who we are. The story of the Longhouse is not finished, will never be finished as long as people study the past and find in it reflections of present concerns, as long as the human questions about how to live well together remain relevant, as long as the archaeological remains endure and scholars work to interpret them. Each generation will find something different in the Longhouse, will ask new questions of the evidence, will draw lessons appropriate to their moment, while the Vikings themselves remain silent in their graves, their homes return to earth, their fires cold forever. But we remember them, we tell their stories still, we honour their survival, and mourn their passing. We learn what we can from the fragments they left behind, and on some deep level we are still sitting on those benches, still tending that fire, still listening to stories told in the darkness, still seeking warmth and meaning and community, still Vikings in our needs and hopes and fears, even when the specifics of our lives could not be more different from theirs. The fire burns on, the winter comes again. We gather close and tell our stories and tend the flames and survive together through the darkness, as humans have always done, as we will continue to do, the eternal hearth still calling us home.